Captains of Souls by Edgar Wallace. Book the first one. Chapter 1. Beryl Merville wrote, Dear Ronnie, we are back from Italy, arriving this afternoon. Daddy thought you would be there to meet us, and I was so disappointed to find nobody but Mr. Stepp. Oh yes, I know that he is a most important person, and his importance was supported by his new car. Such an impressive treasure, with a collapsible writing table and cigar lighter and library. Actually a library and a cunning little locker under one of the seats. I just glanced at them. I'm a little afraid of Mr. Stepp, yet he was kindness itself, and that bull voice of his, bellowing orders to porters and chauffeur and railway policemen, was comforting in a way. Daddy is a little plaintive on such occasions. I thought he was looking unusually striking. Stepp, I mean. People certainly do look at him, with his black, pointed beard and his bristling, black eyebrows. You like him, don't you? Perhaps I should too, only he is very magnetic, a commanding person. He frightens me, I repeat. And I have met another man. I don't think you know him. He said he had never met you. Daddy knows him rather well, and so does Mr. Stepp. Such a queer man, Ronnie. He arrived after Daddy had gone to his club to collect some correspondence. The maid came and told me there was a strange man in the hall who said Dr. Merville had sent for him. So I went down to see him. He made the queerest impression on me. You will be amused, but not flattered, when I confess that the moment I saw him, I thought of you. I had a sort of warm impulse toward him. I felt as though I were meeting you, as I wanted you to be. That sounds feeble and lame, but employing my limited vocabulary to the best of my poor ability, I am striving to reduce my mad impression to words. How mad it was you'll understand. For Ronnie, he was a stoutish man of middle age, no more like you than I am like Mr. Stepp. Yet when I saw this shabbily dressed person, the knees of his trousers shone and the laces of his untidy boots were dragging, I just gasped. He sat squarely on one of the hall chairs, a big, rough hand on each knee, and he was staring in an absent-minded way at the wall. He didn't even see me when I stood almost opposite to him. But his head, Ronnie, it was the head of a conqueror, one of those heroes of antiquity. You see their busts in the museums and wonder who they are. A broad, eagle face, strangely dark, and on top a shock of gray-white hair brushed back into a mane. He had the most beautiful eyes I have ever seen in a man, and when they turned in my direction and he got up from his chair, not awkwardly as I expected, but with the ease of an Augustus, there was within them so much loving kindness that I felt I could have cried. And please, Ronnie, do not tell me that I am neurotic and overtired. I was just mad, nothing worse than that. I'm mad still, for I cannot get him out of my mind. His name is Ambrose Salt, and he is associated with Daddy and Mr. Stepp, though I think that he is really attached to that horrid Greek person to whom Daddy introduced me, Meropulos. What sort of work he does for Meropulos I have not discovered. There is always a great deal of mystery about Mr. Meropulos and Mr. Stepp's business schemes. Sometimes I am very uncomfortable, which is a very mild way of describing my feelings about Daddy and things. Ronnie, you have some kind of business dealings with Father. What is it all about? I should so like to discover. It is to do with companies and corporations, isn't it? I know Mr. Stepp is a great financier, but I don't quite know how financiers work. I suppose I ought not to be curious, but it worries me. No, bothers is a better word sometimes. Come and see me soon, Ronnie. I promise you I won't, you know. I've never forgiven myself for hurting you so. It was such a horrid story. I blame myself for listening and hate myself for telling you. But the girl's brother was so earnest and so terribly upset, and the girl herself was so wickedly circumstantial. You have forgiven me? It was my first experience of blackmailers, and I ought to have known you better and liked you better than to believe that you would be such a brute. And she was such a common girl, too. She stopped writing and looked round. Come in. The maid was straightening her face as she entered. That gentleman, miss, Mr. Salt, is called. Beryl tapped her lips with the feathered pen holder. Did you tell him that the doctor was out? Yes, miss. He asked if you were in. I told him I'd go and see. Something about the visitor had amused the girl, for the corners of her lips twitched. Why are you laughing, Dean? Beryl's manner was unusually cold, and her grave eyes reproving. For no reason that she could assign, she felt called upon to defend this man against the ridicule which she perceived in the maid's attitude. "Oh, miss, he was so strange." He said, "Perhaps she will see me." "Do you mean Miss Merville?" Says I, "Merville," he says in a queer way. Of course, Beryl Merville. And then he said something to himself. It sounded like, "How pitiful. I don't think he is quite all there, miss." "Show him up, please," said Beryl quietly. She recognized the futility of argument. Dean and her type found in the contemplation of harmless lunacy a subject for merriment. And Dean was the best maid she had had for years. She sat waiting for the man, uncertain. Why did she want to see him? She was not really curious by nature, and the crude manners of the class to which he belonged usually rubbed her raw. The foulness of their speech, the ugliness of their ideals and their lives, the gibberish, almost an unknown language to her, of the Cockney man and woman, all these things grated. Perhaps she was a neurotic after all. Ronnie was quite sure of his judgment in most matters affecting her. Ambrose Salt, standing in the doorway, hat in hand, saw her bite her lower lip reflectively. She looked around with a start of surprise, and, seeing him, got up. He was a colored man. She had not realized this before, and she was unaccountably hurt. Just colored, and yet his eyes were gray. "I hope I haven't disturbed you, mademoiselle," he said. His voice was very soft and very sweet. "Mademoiselle?" A Creole, a Madagascan, an Octoroon? From one of the French foreign territories, perhaps. He spoke English without an accent, but the mademoiselle had come so naturally to his lips. "You are French, Mr. Salt? Your name, of course?" She smiled at him questioningly and wondered why she troubled to ask questions at all. "No, mademoiselle." He shook his great head, and the mask of a face did not relax. "I am from Barbados, but I have lived in Port-de-France, that is, in Martinique, for many years. I was also in in New Caledonia, that is also French." There was an awkward silence here. Yet he was not embarrassed and displayed no incertitude of his position. Her dilemma came from the fact that she judged men by her experience and acquaintance with them, and the empirical method fails before the unusual. Ambrose Salt was that. "My father will be home very soon, Mr. Salt. Won't you please sit down?" As he chose a chair with some deliberation, it occurred to her that she would find a difficulty in explaining to the fastidious Dr. Merville why she had invited this man to await him in the drawing room. Strangely enough, she herself felt the capacity of entertaining and being entertained by the visitor, and she had no such spasm of dismay as had come to her when other, and more presentable, visitors had settled themselves for a lengthy call. This fact puzzled her. Ambrose Salt was an artisan, perhaps a messenger more likely. The shabbiness of his raiment and the carelessness of his attire suggested some menial position. One waistcoat button had been fastened into the wrong buttonhole. The result was a little grotesque. "Have you been working very long with my father?" she asked. "No, not a very long time," he said. "Marapulos and Stepp know him better than I." He checked himself. She knew that he would not talk any more about his associates, and the enigma which their companionship presented would remain unsolved, so far as he could give a solution. Marapulos, Stepp? He spoke as an equal. Even Ronnie was deferential to Mr. Stepp and was in awe of him. Her father made no attempt to hide his nervousness in the presence of that formidable person. Yet this man could dispense with the title. It was not bravado on his part, the conscious impertinence of an underling, desirous of asserting his equality. Obviously, he thought of Mr. Stepp as Stepp. What would he call her father? No occasion arose, but she was certain he would have been Merville and no more. Salt's eyes were settled on her, absorbing her. Yet his gaze lacked offense, being without hostility or notable admiration. She had a ridiculous sensibility of praise. So he might have looked upon Naples from the sea, or upon the fields of narcissi above Les Avants, or the breathtaking loveliness of the hills of Montecatini in the blue afterlight of sunset. She could not meet his eyes, yet was without discomfort. The praise of his conspection was not human. She laughed, artificially, she thought, and reached out for a book that lay on the table. "We have just returned from Italy," she said. "Do you know Italy at all, Mr. Salt?" "I do not know Italy," he said, and took the book she held to him. "This is rather a wonderful account of Lombardy and its history," she said. "Perhaps you would like to read it?" He turned the leaves idly and smiled at her. She had never seen a man smile so sweetly. "I cannot read," he said simply. She did not understand his meaning for a while, thinking that his eyesight was failing. Perhaps he would care to take it home? He shook his head, and the book came back to her. I cannot read, he said without shame, or write. At least I cannot write words. Figures, yes, figures are easy. Somebody told me, he was a professor of English I think, at one of the universities, that it was astonishing that I could work out mathematical problems and employ all the signs and symbols of trigonometry and algebra without being able to write. I wish I could read. When I pass a bookshop, I feel like an armless man who is starving within hand's reach of salvation. I know a great deal, and I pay a man to read to me, Livy and Prescott and Green, and, of course, Bacon. I know them all. Writing does not worry me. I have no friends. If he had spoken apologetically, if he had displayed the least aggression, she might have classified and held him in a place. But he spoke of his shortcomings as he might have spoken of his gray hair, as a phenomenon beyond his ordering. She was thunderstruck. Possibly he was so used to shocking people from this cause that he did not appear to observe the effect he had produced. He was so completely content with this, the first contact with his dream woman, that he was almost incapable of receiving any other impression. Her hair was fairer than he had thought, the nose thinner, the molding of her delicate face more spirituelle, the lips redder and fuller, the rounded chin less firm, and the eyes. He wished she would turn her head so that he could be sure of their color. They were big, set wide apart. There was depth in them and a something upon which he yearned. The figure of her he knew by heart, straight and tall and most gracious. A patrician. He thought of her as that. An Oriental. He had pictured her as a great lady at Constantine's court. He set her upon the marble terrace of a decent villa on the hills above the Chrysopolis. A woman of an illustrious order. She could never suspect that he thought of her at all as a distinct personality. She could not guess that he knew her as well as his own right hand. That day after day, he had waited in the row, a shabby and inconspicuous figure amongst the smart loungers, waited for the benison of her presence. She had not seen him in Devon in the spring. He had been there, lying on the rain-soaked grass of Tapper Downs to watch her walking with her father. Sitting amidst gorse on the steep slope of the cliff, she unconscious of his guardianship, reading in her chair on the smooth beach. How curious. I nearly said sad. But you do not feel very sad about it, Mr. Salt, do you? Amused, he shook his head. It would be irritating, he said, if I were sorry for myself. But I am never that. Half the unhappiness of life comes from the vanity of self-pity. It is the mother of all bitterness. Do you realize that? You cannot feel bitter without feeling sorry for yourself. She nodded. You miss a great deal, but you know that poetry. I suppose you have that read to you? Ambrose Salt laughed softly. Yes, poetry. Out of the dark which covers me, black as a pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods there be for my unconquerable soul. That poem and Theocrite, and only 2 lines of Theocrite, are the beginning and the end of my poetical leanings. I attend lectures, of course. Lectures on English, on architecture, music, history, especially history, 100 subjects. And mathematics. You can get those in the extension classes only. Unfortunately, I cannot qualify for admission to the classes themselves. Have you never tried to read and write? Yes. My room is packed with little books and big books. A-B, CAT, cat, and copybooks. But I just can't. I can write the letters of the alphabet, a few of them that are necessary for mathematical calculations. Very well, but I cannot go any further. I seem to slip into a fog, a sort of impenetrable wall of thick mist that confuses and baffles me. I know that CAT is cat, but when I see cat written, it is a meaningless combination of straight and curved lines. It is sheerly physical. The doctors have a word for it. I cannot remember what it is for the moment. I just can't read. Dr. Merville came in at that moment, a thin, colorless man, myopic, irritable, chronically worried. He entered the drawing room hurriedly. Beryl thought he must have run upstairs. His frowning, dissatisfied glance was toward Salt, the girl he ignored. Hello, Salt. Had no idea you were here. Will you come into my study? He was breathless, and Beryl knew by the signs that he was angry about something. It occurred to her instantly that he was annoyed with her for entertaining the untidy visitor. The study was next door to the drawing room, and he walked out with a beckoning jerk of his chin. "I am glad to have met you, mademoiselle." Ambrose Salt was not to be hurried. Returning to the open doorway, Dr. Merville, clucking his impatience, witnessed the leisurely leave-taking. The study door had scarcely closed on the visitor before it opened again, and her father returned. "Why the deuce did you ask that fellow up, Beryl? He could have very well waited in the servants' hall, or in the breakfast room, or anywhere. Suppose somebody had called." "I thought he was a friend of Mr. Stepp's," she said calmly. "You know such extraordinary people." "What is he?" "Who's Salt?" "Well, he is—" Dr. Merville was not immediately prepared to define the position of his visitor. "In a sense, he is an employee of Marapulo's. Picked him up in his travels. He is an anarchist." She stared. "And what?" "Well, not exactly an anarchist, communist. Anyway, he has quaint views on things. Believes in the equality of the human race. An extraordinary fellow, a dreamer, got a crazy idea of raising $1 million to found a college. That's what he calls it, the Mother College. Can't stop now, darling, but please don't make a fuss of him. He's just a little difficult, as it is. I will tell you about him some day." He bustled out of the room, and the study door closed with a thud. Beryl Merville considered Ambrose Salt for a very long time before she turned to her writing table, where the unfinished letter to Ronald Morel invited a conclusion. Chapter 2. "Well, Salt, why have you come? Anything wrong?" Beryl would have thought Dr. Merville's manner strangely mild and conciliatory after his show of antagonism toward the visitor. Salt had seated himself on the edge of a low Chesterfield under the curtained window. "Marapulo's is worried about some people who called at his bureau today. They came to ask him about a letter that had been sent to him from South Africa by the assistant manager of the Brackfontein diamond mine." Merville was standing by the library table in the center of the room. The hand that played with the leaves of a magazine was trembling ever so slightly. "What has happened? How did they know? Who were they?" he demanded shakily. "I think it was the managing director, the American gentleman. He was very angry. They discovered that the manager had been receiving money from London soon after he made his report. Marapulo's told me that the shares had dropped 30 points since yesterday morning. Mr. Diverley said that Marapulo's and his gang, those were the words I think, had bribed the manager to keep back the report that the mine was played out. I suppose he did. I know very little about stocks and shares." Dr. Merville was biting his knuckles, a weak and vacillating man. Salt had no doubts as to this, and it hurt him every time he realized that this invertebrate creature was Beryl Merville's father. How and why had he come into the strange confederation? "I can do nothing." The doctor was fretful, his voice jerky. He fixed and removed his pince-nez and fixed them again. "Nothing. I do not know why these people make inquiries. There was nothing dishonest in selling stock which you know will fall. It is a part of the process of speculation, isn't it, Salt? All the big houses work on secret information received or bought. If Marapulo's or Stepp care to buy information, that is nobody's affair. There may be an inquiry on the stock exchange," said Salt calmly. "Marapulo's asked me to tell you that. The Johannesburg Committee have taken up the matter and have called for information. You see, the manager has confessed." "Confessed?" gasped the doctor and went white. "So Mr. Diverley says. He has told the directors that Marapulo's had the information a month before the directors." The doctor sat down heavily on the nearest chair. "I don't see that it affects us," he protested feebly. "There is no offense in getting a tip about a failing property, is there, Salt?" "I don't know. Marapulo's says it is conspiracy. They can prove it if they find the letters which the manager wrote. Marapulo's has them in his desk." Merville sprang up. "Then they must be destroyed," he cried violently. "It is madness to keep them. I had no idea. Of course he must burn them. Go back and tell him to do this, Salt." Ambrose Salt put his hand into the fold of his shabby jacket and brought out a bundle of documents. "They are here," he said in a matter-of-fact tone. "Marapulo's says that you must keep them. They may get a warrant to search his house." "Keep them I?" Merville almost screamed. "Marapulo's is a fool." "Burn them." Salt shook his head. "Stepp say no. They may be useful later. You must keep them, doctor. It is Stepp's wish. Tomorrow I will start working on the safe." Dr. Merville took the papers from the outstretched hand and looked around helplessly. There was a steel box on his desk. He took out his key, looked again and more dubiously at the packet of letters, and dropped them into the box. "What is this safe, Salt? I know that you are a devilish clever fellow with your hands, and Marapulos mentioned something about a safe. You are not making it." Salt nodded, and there was a gleam in his fine eyes. "But why? Marapulos has a safe, and Steppe must possess dozens. Why not buy another, if he must have a special place for these wretched things?" "You cannot buy the safe that I shall make," said the dark man quietly. "It has taken me a year to invent the dial. Yes, combination. They are easy, but not this one. A word will open it, any other word, any other combination of letters, and there will be nothing to find." The doctor frowned. "You mean if any other person, the police for example, try to open the safe, the contents are destroyed?" Salt nodded. "How?" The visitor, his business at an end, rose. "That is simple, a twist of the hand. Unless the combination is true, releases a quart of acid. Any of the corrosive acids will serve." Merville bent his head in thought. Presently, he saw a flaw in the invention. "Suppose they don't touch the lock?" he asked. "Suppose they burn out the side of the safe? It can be done, I believe." "What then?" Ambrose Salt gave that soft laugh of his. "The sides will be hollow and filled from the inside of the safe, with water pumped in at a pressure. Cut through the safe, and the water escapes and releases a plunger that brings about the same result. The contents of the safe are destroyed. You are a strange creature, the strangest I have met. I don't understand you." Merville shook his head. "I hope you will hurry with that safe." As Salt was at the door, he asked, "Where did Marapulos find you, Salt?" The man turned. "He found me in the sea," he said. "Marapulos was trading in those days. He had a sloop pearl smuggling, I think. I thought he had told you. I never make any secret about it." "In the sea? For heaven's sake, what do you mean?" "Where?" 10 miles off the Isle of Pines. I got away from Noumea in a boat. Noumea is the capital of New Caledonia. I and 3 Kanaks, they were under sentence for cannibalism. We ran into a cyclone and swamped, just as we were trying to make the sloop which was standing into the lee of the island. Marapulos took me on board, and the natives. When he found that I was a convict, a French convict." Salt was leaning easily, his cheek against the hand that gripped the edge of the open door. He nodded. "I thought he had told you. Of course, he would have taken me back to Noumea for the reward. Only he had a cargo on board which he did not want the French to see. I found afterwards that when we called at the Loyalty Island, he tried to sell me back but couldn't get a price." He smiled broadly, as at a very pleasant recollection. "Marapulos would sell me now," he said, "only I am useful." "But why? Why were you imprisoned?" asked Merville, awe-stricken at the tremendous revelation. "I killed a man," said Salt. "Good night, Doctor." Chapter 3. It was a Monday morning and a bank holiday. A few regular habitués of the park, to whom the word holiday had no especial significance, had overlooked the fact and took their cantering exercise a little self-consciously under admiring eyes of the people who seldom saw people riding on horseback for the pleasure of it. The day was fine and warm. The hawthorn trees were thickly frosted with their cerise and white blossoms. Stiff crocuses flamed in every bed, and the banners of the daffodils fluttered in the light breeze that blew half-heartedly across the wide green spaces. On every path the holiday-makers straggled, small mothers laden with large babies, shop boys in garments secretly modeled on the supermen they served, girls from the stores in their bargain-price finery, young men with and without hats, the waitresses of closed tea shops, and here and there a pompous member of the bourgeoisie conscious of his superiority to the crowd with which, in his condescension, he mingled. There is one shady place which faces Park Lane, a stretch of wooded lawn where garden chairs are set 6 deep. Behind this phalanx there is an irregular fringe of seats, usually in couples, and greatly in request during the darker hours. In the early morning, before the energies of the promenaders are exhausted, the spot is deserted. But 2 young people occupied chairs this morning. There was nothing in the appearance of the girl that would have made the companionship seem incongruous. In her tailored costume, the unobtrusive hat, and the simplicity of her toilette, she might as well have been the youngest daughter of a duke or a work girl with a judgment in dress. Her clothes would not be priced by the most expert of women critics, and even stockings and shoes, the last hope of the appraiser, would have baffled. No two glances would have been required to put the man in his class. If he was a thought dandified, it was the dandification of a gentleman. He looked what he was, a man of leisure, the type which is to be found in the Guards or the smartest regiment of cavalry. Yet Ronald Morrell was no soldier. He had served during the war, but had seen none of its devastations. He hated the violence of battle and despised the vulgarity of noisy patriotism. His knowledge of Italian had secured him a quasi-diplomatic appointment, nominally at the Italian headquarters, actually in Rome. He had used every influence that could be employed, pulled every string that could be pulled, to keep him from the disorder of the front line, and fortune had favored him to an extraordinary extent. On the very day he received instructions to report to the regiment with which he had trained, the armistice was signed. He saw the last line of trenches which the British had prepared but never occupied, south of Amiens, saw them from the train that carried him home, and thought that they looked beastly uncomfortable. The girl by his side would not be alone in thinking him good-looking. He was that rarity, a perfectly featured man. His skin was faultless. His straight nose, his deep-set brown eyes, his irreproachable mouth were excellent. The hypercritical might cavil at the almost feminine chin. A small brown mustache was probably responsible for the illusion that he favored the profession of arms. Evie Colebrook thought he was the most beautiful man in the world, and when he smiled, as he was smiling now, she dared not look at him. He was talking about looks, and she was deliciously flattered. "How ridiculous you are, Mr. Morrell," she protested. "I suppose you have said that to thousands and thousands of girls?" "Not quite so many, Evie," he answered. "To be exact, I can't remember having been so shamelessly complimentary to any girl before. You need not call me Mr. Morrell unless you wish to. My friends call me Ronnie. She played with the handkerchief on her lap. "It seems so familiar. Honestly, Ronnie, aren't you rather— what is the word? The book you lent me? A play? A philanderer?" suggested the other. "My dear child, how silly you are. Of course I'm not. Very few people have impressed me as you have. It must have been fate that took me into Bert's. I never go into shops, but Francois, that's my man. I know him," she nodded. "He often comes in. I used to wonder who he was. He was out, and I forget what it was I wanted, even forget whether I bought it. I must have done. Otherwise, I should not have found myself staring over a pay desk at the most lovely girl in all the world." She laughed, a gurgling laugh of sheer happiness, and looked at him swiftly before she dropped her eyes again. "I like to hear that," she said softly. "It is so wonderful that you like me, I mean, because I'm nothing really. And you're a well gentleman. I know you hate the word, but you are. Miles and miles above me. Why, I live in a miserable little house in a horrible neighborhood, full of thieves and terrible creatures who drink. And my mother does odd jobs for people, and I'm not very well educated, really. I can read and write, but I'm not half so clever as Christina. That is my sister. She's an invalid and reads all day and all night, too, if I'd let her." He was watching her as she spoke. The play of color in her pretty face, the rise and fall of her narrow chest, the curve of chin, and the velvet smoothness of her throat. He marked them all with the eye of the gourmet who watches lambs frisking in the pasture and sees, not the poetry and beauty of young life, but a likable dish that will one day mature. "If you were a beggar maid and I were a prince," he began. "I'm not much better, am I?" she asked ruefully. "And you are a prince to me, Ronnie," she was thinking. "Yes. How can anything come right for us? I don't want to think about it, and I try ever so hard to keep it out of my thoughts. I'm so happy meeting you and loving you, and tomorrow never comes, but— You mean how will this dear friendship end?" She nodded. "How would you like it to end?" Evie Colebrook poked the ferrule of her sunshade into the grass and turned up a tuft of clover. "There is only one way it can ever end, happily," she said in a low voice, "and that is, well, you know, Ronnie." He laughed. "With you in a beautiful white dress and a beautiful white veil and a wreath of orange blossoms round your glorious hair, and a fat and nasty old man in a surplice reading a few passages from a book, and people leering at you as you go down the aisle and saying, well, you know what they say. I think a wedding is the most indelicate function which society affects." She said nothing, but continued prodding at the turf. "It can be done quietly," she said at last. Leaning toward her, he slipped his hand under her arm. "Evie, is love nothing?" he asked earnestly. "Isn't it the biggest thing? What is the most decent? A wedding between two people who half hate one another, but are marrying because one wants money and the other a swagger wife. Or an everlasting love union between a man and a woman whom God has bound with bonds that a parson cannot strengthen or a snuffy judge cannot break." She sighed the quick, double sigh of one half convinced. "You make me feel that I'm common and brainless, and anyway, I don't want to talk about it. Ronnie, I suppose you're awfully busy this morning." She looked wistfully at the big rolls that was drawn up by the side of the road. "I am rather," he said. "I wish I weren't. I'd love to drive you somewhere. Anywhere so long as you were by my side, little fairy. When shall I see you again?" "On Sunday," she asked as they strolled toward the car. "Why not come up to the flat to tea on Saturday afternoon?" he suggested, but she shook her head. "I'd rather not, Ronnie. Do you mind?" "Well, I don't want to somehow. Am I an awful pig?" He smiled down on her. "Of course not. Oh, damn." A girl on a horse had just cantered past. She saw him and lifted her whip to acknowledge his raised hat. "Who is that?" Evie was more than curious. "A girl I know," he said suavely. "The daughter of my doctor, and rather a gossip. You're ashamed of being seen with me." "Rubbish," he laughed. "I am so proud of you that I wish she had stopped. Confound her." He took her hand and smiled into her eyes. "Goodbye, beloved," he breathed. Evie Colebrook watched the car until it had turned out of sight. It was following the gossiping girl, but she did not care. She went home walking on air. At the corner of the row, the big car drew abreast of the rider. "Why on earth are you riding on bank holiday, Beryl? The park is full of louts, and there aren't half a dozen people in the row." Beryl Merville looked at him quizzically. "And why on earth are you in the park, Ronnie? And who is your beautiful little friend?" He frowned. "Friend? Oh, you mean the girl I was speaking to? Would you call her beautiful? Yes, I suppose she is pretty, but quite a kid. Her father is an old friend of mine, Colonel. I forget his name. He is something at the War Office. I have an idea they live near the park." I saw her walking and stopped the car to talk to her. Frankly, I was so bored that I almost fell on her neck. I wasn't with her for 5 minutes. Beryl nodded and dismissed the matter from her mind. She was more interested in another subject. "Yes, dear. I had your letter. I'm an awful brute not to have come over and seen you. But the fact is I have been working hard. Don't sneer, Beryl. I really have. Sturgeon, the editor of the Post-Herald, has discovered in me a latent genius for writing. It is rather fun. Apparently I have a flair for that kind of work. But, Ronnie, this is great news. Stop your car by the corner and find a man to hold my horse. There is an awful lot I want to talk to you about." He parked his car and, helping her dismount, handed the reins to an idle groom. A watchful attendant drew near. "You will have to pay for the seats, Ronnie. I have no money. Happily, I have 2 tickets, he said and realized his mistake before he drew them from his pocket. "I thought you hadn't been with your colonel's daughter more than 5 minutes, she challenged and laughed. "I sometimes think that you'd rather lie than eat." "My dear Beryl," Mr. Morell's tone revealed both shock and injury. "Did I say that I didn't sit with her? I couldn't be so uncivil as to expect her to stand. The fact is that she hinted that she would like me to drive around the park, and I had no wish to." "Never mind your guilty secret," she said gaily. "Tell me all about your new job." "Poor Ronnie, so they have made you work at last." "I feared this." Ronnie smiled good-naturedly. "It is amusing," he said. "I was always rather keen on that kind of work, even when I was at Oxford. Sturgeon saw some verses of mine in one of the quarterlies and asked me if I would care to describe a motor car race, the Gordon Bennett Cup. I took it on, and he seemed immensely pleased with the account I wrote. I feel that I am doing some poor devil out of a job, but it doesn't keep you awake at nights," she finished. "But how lovely, Ronald. You will be able to describe Mr. Stepp's trial. Everybody says that one of these days he will be tried." Ronald Morell was not amused. She saw a frown gather on his forehead and remembered that he and Mr. Stepp had some association. "Of course I'm joking, Ronnie. How awfully touchy you are. Mr. Stepp is quite nice, and people invariably say unpleasant things about a successful man." Stepp, he paused. There was a nervousness in his manner and in his tone which he could not disguise. Stepp is quite a good fellow. A little rough, but he was trained in a rough school. He is very nearly the cleverest financier in this country or any other. He would have changed the conversation had she not interpolated a question. I do not know him. Salt, you said? No, I've never met him. He does odd jobs for Moropulos. A half-caste, isn't he? What nerve the fellow had to come to the house. Why didn't you kick him out? It is obvious that you haven't seen him, or you wouldn't ask such a question, she replied, her eyes twinkling. I don't know what he does, Ronnie went on. Stepp has a good opinion of him. That is all I know. He has 3 decorations for something he did in the war. He was in the field ambulance and brought in a lot of people from no man's land. He is quite old, isn't he? She nodded. Moropulos isn't anything to boast about. Stepp likes him, though. Apparently the cachet of Mr. Stepp satisfied Ronnie in all things. He's a Greek. You've met him? A sleek devil. They say that he's afraid except when he is drunk. Ronnie, a fact. Moropulos drinks like a fish. Absinthe and all sorts of stuff. Stepp told me. That is why this nigger fellow Salt is useful. Salt is the only man who can handle him. He's as strong as an ox. There isn't a smarter devil than Moropulos. He has the brain of a cabinet minister and is as close as an oyster. But when the fit is on him, he'd stand up in the street and talk himself into jail. And others. Not Stepp, of course, he added hastily. Stepp has nothing to be afraid of. Only, well, Moropulos might say things that would look bad. And is that all? She asked with an odd sense of disappointment. Doesn't Mr. Salt do anything else but act as a sort of keeper? Ronnie, already weary of the subject, yawned behind his hand. Awfully sorry, but I was up late last night. Salt? Oh yes, I believe he does odd jobs. He is rather an ugly brute, isn't he? She did not answer this. Her interest in the man puzzled her. He appealed in a strange fashion to something within her that was very wholesome. She was glad, very glad, about his war decorations. That he should have done fine things. She liked to forget Ronnie's war services. I wish I had decided to ride this morning, complained Ronnie. I never dreamed you would be out on a day like this. Why I came into the park at all, I really do not know. I didn't realize it was a bank holiday and that all these dreadful people would be unchained for the day. How is the doctor? Well? She nodded. He looked a little peaked when I saw him last. Look, Beryl's Stepp. A car, headed for Marble Arch, had swerved across the road in response to the signal of its occupant. It pulled up behind Ronald's machine, and Mr. Stepp, with his queer sideways smile, alighted, waving a white-gloved hand. Oh dear, said Beryl plaintively. Why did I get off that horse? I could have pretended that I had not recognized him. My dear girl. Ronald was genuinely distressed, and it came to Beryl in the nature of an unpleasant discovery that he was so completely in awe of the financier, that his manner, his attitude, the very tone of his voice, changed at the sight of him. And Stepp seemed to expect this homage, took it as his right, dismissed and obliterated Ronnie from participation with a jerk of his head intended as an acknowledgment of his greeting and as an excusal of his presence. Beryl could not help realizing his unimportance in the millionaire scheme of life. The photographs of Jan Stepp, which have from time to time appeared in the public press, at once flatter and disparage him. The lens has depicted faithfully the short black beard, the thick black eyebrows, the broad nose, and the thick bull neck of him. They missed his immense vitality, the aura of power which enveloped him, his dominant and forceful ego. His voice was thick and deep, sometimes in a moment of excitement guttural, for his grandfather had been a Transvaal Boer, a Bywerner who had become, successively, farmer and mine owner. Jan Cornelius Stepp I had spoken no English. His son Commandant Stepp, an enlightened and scholarly man, spoke it well. He had been killed at Tegela Drift in the war, whilst Jan III was in England at a preparation school. Ha! Beryl! Very good luck, huh? I shall miss my train, but it is worthwhile. Riding? God! I wish I wasn't so fat and lazy. Motor cars are the ruin of us. My grandfather rode 20 miles a day, and my father was never off a horse. Huh! Beryl often asked her father why Mr. Stepp grunted at the end of his every question. But it was not a grunt. It was a throaty growl cut short, a terrifying mannerism of his, meaningless but menacing. She used to wonder whether the impression of ruthless ferocity which he gave was not more than half due to this peculiarity. He towered above her, a mountain of a man, broad of shoulder and long of arm. There was something simian about him, something that was almost obscene. He was fond of describing himself as fat, but this was an exaggeration. He had bulk, he was in the truest sense gross, but she would not have described him as fat. "Sit down," he commanded. "I haven't seen you since Friday. The doctor came in yesterday morning." "Nerves, huh? What's the matter with him?" Beryl laughed. "Father receives a great deal of misplaced sympathy. He is really very well. He has been jumpy ever since I can remember." Stepp nodded. He was sitting by her side in the chair vacated by Ronnie, and Ronnie was standing. "Sit down, Ronnie." She pointed to a chair at the other side of her. No, thank you, Beryl," he said hastily, for all the world like a schoolboy asked to sit in the presence of his master. "Sit down," growled Stepp, and to the girl's amazement, Ronnie sat. It was the only notice Jan Stepp took of his presence throughout the interview, and Ronnie neither showed resentment nor made the slightest attempt to intrude into the conversation that followed. Presently Stepp looked at his watch. "I can catch that train," he said, and got up. "You're coming to dinner with me next week. I'll fix the date with the doctor." She said she would be delighted. Something of the mastership extended to her. "You saw Salt?" He turned back after he had taken her hand. "Queer fellow, huh? Big man, huh?" "I thought he was interesting," she admitted. "Yes, interesting. A man." He glowered at Ronald Morell. "Interesting," he repeated and went away with that. Her fascinated gaze followed him as he strode toward the car. "Paddington. Get me there, damn you," she heard him say, and when the car had gone, "Dynamic," she said with a sigh. "He is like a powerhouse. When I shake hands with him, I feel as though I'm going to get a bad burn." "You were very silent, Ronnie." "Yes, absently. Old Stepp is rather a shocker, isn't he? How did he know you had seen Salt?" "Father told him, I suppose." "Ronnie, are you afraid of Mr. Stepp?" He colored. "Afraid? How stupid you are, Beryl. Why should I be afraid of him? I do business with him. I'm a director of a company or two. He put me into them. One has to, how shall I put it? One has to be polite to these people. I'll go along now. Beryl, a lot of work to do." He was uncomfortable, and she did not pursue the subject. The knowledge brought a little ache to her heart, that Ronnie was afraid of Jan Stepp. She would have given her soul to respect Ronald Morell as she respected the swarthy, gray-haired man whom even Stepp respected. Chapter 4. "Children," said Mrs. Colebrook, peering into the saucepan that bubbled and splashed and steamed on the kitchen fire, "are a great responsibility, especially in this neighborhood where, as you might say, there is nothing but raffle." Sometime in her youth, it is probable that Mrs. Colebrook had to choose between rabble and riff-raff and had found a compromise. That man Starker who lives up the street, number 39, I think it is, no, maybe it's 37, it is the house before the sweeps. Well, I did think he was all right, geraniums in his window too, and canaries. A very homely man, wouldn't say boo to a goose. He got 9 months this morning. Ambrose Salt, sitting in a wooden chair which was wedged tightly between the kitchen table and the dresser, drummed his fingers absently upon the polished cloth table cover and nodded. His dark, sallow face wore an expression of strained interest. "Evie, well, I'm worried about Evie. She sits and broods. There's no other word for it, by the hour, and she used to be such a bright, cheerful girl. I wonder sometimes if it is through her working at the drug stores. Being attached to medicines in a manner of speaking, you're bound to hear awful stories, people's insides and all that sort of thing. It is depressing for a young girl. Christina says she talks in her sleep and moans and tosses about. It can't be over a young man, or she'd bring him home. I asked her the other day. I think a girl's best friend is her mother, and all I got was, 'Oh, shut up, mother.' In my young days, I wouldn't have dared speak to my mother like that, but girls have changed. They want to go to business, cashiering and typewriting, and such nonsense. I went out of service when I was 16 and was first parlor maid before I was 20. But talk to these girls about going into domestic service and they laugh at you." A silence followed which Salt felt it was his duty to break. "I suppose they do. Life is very hard on women, even the most favored of women. I hardly blame them for getting whatever happiness they can. Happiness, scoffed Mrs. Colebrook, shifting the saucepan to the hob. It all depends on what you call happiness. I don't see much happiness in standing in a drafty shop taking money all day and adding up figures and stamping bills. Besides, look at the temptation. She meets all kind of people. I think I'll go upstairs to my room, Mrs. Colebrook. I want to do a little work. You're a worker, said Mrs. Colebrook admiringly. I'll call you when supper is ready. May I walk in to see Christina? He asked permission in the same words every night and received the same answer. Of course you can. You need never ask, Mr. Salt. She'll be glad to see you. At the head of the narrow stairway, Salt knocked on a door, and a cheerful voice bade him come in. It was a small room containing 2 beds. That which was nearest the window was occupied by a girl whose pallor was made more strangely apparent by a mop of bright red hair. Over her head, and hooked to the wall, was a kerosene lamp of unusual design and brilliance. She had been reading, and one white hand lay over the open page of a book by her side. Salt looked up at the lamp, touched the button that controlled the light, and peered into the flame. Working all right? Fine, she said enthusiastically. You're a brick, Ambrose, to make it. I had no idea you could do anything like that. Mother won't touch it. The thinks it will explode. It can't explode, he said, shaking his head. Those vapor gas lamps are safe, unless you fool with them. Have it put outside the door in the morning, and I'll fill it. Well, where have you been today, Christina? She showed her small white teeth in a smile. To Etruria, she said solemnly. It is the country that was old when Rome was young. I went on an exploring expedition. We left Croydon Aerodrome by airplane and stayed overnight in Paris. My fiancé is a French marquis, and we stayed at his place in the Avenue Kleber. The next morning we went by special train to Rome. I visited the Colosseum by car and saw the temples and the ruins. I spent another day at the Vatican and St. Peter's and saw the Pope. Then we went on to Volsinii and Tarquinii, and I found a wonderful old tomb full of glorious Etruscan ware plates and amphoras and vases. They must have been worth millions. There we met a magician. He lived in an old ruined house on the side of the hill. He had a flock of goats and gave us milk. It was magic milk, for suddenly we found ourselves in the midst of an enormous marble city full of beautiful men and women in togas and wonderful robes. The streets were filled with rich chariots drawn by little horses. The chariots shone like gold and were covered with figures of lions and hunters, and trees and scrolls. Wonderful. And the gardens? They were beautiful. Flowers of every kind, heliotrope and roses and big, white trumpet lilies, and the marble houses were covered with wisteria. Oh dear, Etruria, repeated Salt thoughtfully. Older than Rome? Of course, there must have been people before the Romans, the sort of ancient Britons of Rome. Her eyes, fixed on his, were gleaming with merriment. Of course, I told you about the marvelous trip I had to China, when I was the lovely concubine of Yang Keifi, and how the eunuch strangled me. That was long after Rome, but China was 2,000 years old then. I remember, he said soberly. You went to China once before then. His glance fell on the pages of the book, and he picked it up, turning its meaningless leaves. It is all about Etruria, she said. Evie borrowed it from the store. They have a circulating library at the store. Have you seen Evie? He shook his head. Not for weeks, he said. I'm usually in my room when she comes home. Christina Colebrook, invalid and visionary, puckered her smooth brows into a frown. She had emerged from her world of dreams and make-believe and was facing the ugliness of life that eddied about her bed. Evie is changed quite a lot, she said. She is quieter and dresses more carefully. Not in the way you would notice, she always had good taste, but especially in the way of underclothes. All girls adore swagger underclothes. They live in dread that one day they will be knocked down by a motor bus and taken to a hospital wearing a shabby camisole. But Evie, she's collecting all sorts of things. You might think she was getting together a trousseau. Has she ever spoken to you about anybody called Ronnie? No, she never speaks to me, said Ambrose. You know nobody called Ronnie? He signified his ignorance. At the moment he did not associate the name. She talks in her sleep, Christina went on slowly, and she's spoken that name lots of times. I haven't told Mother. What would be the good, with her heart as it is? Ronnie is the man who is worrying her. I think she is in love with him, or what she thinks is love. And he is somebody in a good station of life, because once she called out in the middle of the night, "Ronnie, take me in your car." Salt was silent. This was the first time Christina had ever spoken to him about the girl. "There is only one thing that can happen," said she wisely, "and that would break Mother's heart. Mother has very narrow views. The people of our class have. I should feel that way myself if I hadn't seen the world." She patted the book by her side. "Perhaps Mother's view is right. She is respectable, and the old Roman Emperor Constantine, when he classified the nobility, made the respectable much superior to the honorable." "What do you mean about Evie?" "I mean that she'll come to me one night and tell me that she is in trouble. And then I shall have to get Mother into a philosophical mood and try to make her see that it is better for a child to be illegitimate than not to be born at all." "Good gracious," said Ambrose, startled. "But it may be just a friendship." "Rats," said Christina contemptuously. "Friendships between attractive shop girls and well-to-do young men. I've heard about M. Platonic. Have you ever heard of Archianassa? She was Plato's mistress. He didn't even practice the kind of love that is named after him. Evie is a good girl and has really fine principles. I shock her awfully at times. I wish I didn't. I don't mean I wish I didn't say things that make her shocked, but that she wouldn't be shocked at all. You have to have a funny kink in your mind before you take offense at the woman and man facts. If you blush easily, you fall easily. I wish to God Evie wasn't so pretty. And she's a dear too, Ambrose. She has great schemes for getting me away to a country where my peculiar ailment will dissolve under uninterrupted sunlight. Poor darling. It would be better if she thought more of her own dangerous sickness." "Ronald Morell," said Ambrose suddenly. "But it wouldn't be he." "Who is Ronald Morell?" "He is the only Ronald I know. I don't even know him. He's a friend of a friend of mine." "Rich, where does he live?" "In Knightsbridge somewhere." Christina whistled. "Glory be. Evie's shop is in Knightsbridge." At 11 o'clock that night, Evie Colebrook came into the room, and as she stooped over the bed to kiss her sister, Christina saw something. "You've been crying, Evie?" Evie turned away quickly and began to unfasten her skirt. I twisted my ankle, slipped off the sidewalk. I was a baby to cry." Christina watched her as she undressed rapidly. "You haven't said your prayers, Evie." "Damn my prayers." There was a little choke at the end. "Put out the light, Christina. I'm awfully tired." Christina reached up for the dangling chain that Ambrose Salt had fixed to the lamp, but she did not immediately pull it. "Mr. Salt was talking about people he knew tonight," she said carelessly. "Have you ever heard of a man called Ronald Morell?" There was no answer then. "Good night, Christina." Christina pulled the chain, and the light went out. Chapter 5. Beryl Merville told herself, at least once a day, that the average girl did not give two thoughts about the source of her father's income. In her case, there was less reason why she should trouble her head. Dr. Merville had retired from practice 4 years before. In his time, he was what is loosely described as a fashionable physician, and certainly was regarded as one of the first authorities of cardiac diseases in the country. His practice as a consultant was an extensive one, and his fees were exceptionally high, even for a fashionable physician. When he retired, he was indubitably a rich man. He sold his house in Devonshire Street and bought a more pretentious home in Park Place. But the zest for speculation, repressed during the time he was following his profession, had occupied the hours of leisure which retirement brought to him. An active man, well under 60, the emptiness of his days, after he had turned over his work, filled him with dismay. He had broken violently from the routine of 25 years and found time the heaviest of the burdens he had ever carried. He tried to find interests and failed. He was under an agreement to the doctor who had purchased his practice not to return to his profession, or he would have been back in Devonshire Street a month after he had left. He bought a few thoroughbreds and sent them to a trainer, but he had no love for the turf, and, although he won a few respectable stakes, he quitted the game at the end of the first season. Then he tried the stock market, made a few thousands in oil, and grew more interested. A rubber speculation hurt him, but not so much that his enthusiasm was damped or his bank balance was seriously affected. He followed this loss with what might have been a disastrous investment in South African mines. Then, at a nerve-wracking moment, came Stepp, who held up the market and let out Merville, bruised and shaken, but not ruinously so. Here might have ended the speculative career of Dr. Merville, had he not been under an obligation to the South African. Within a month of their meeting, the doctor's name appeared on the prospectus of one of Stepp's companies, a mild and unromantic cold storage flotation, which was a success in every sense. Merville had many friends in society, people who might look askance at the name of Jan Stepp and be disturbed by the recollection of certain other companies which that gentleman had floated, accepted Dr. Merville's directorship as evidence of the company's stability and financial soundness. The issue was oversubscribed and paid a dividend from the first year. This object lesson was not lost upon the big man. He followed the promotion with another. The East Rand Consolidated Deep was floated for $750,000. Applications came in for $2 million. Dr. Merville was chairman of the board. Even Jan Stepp was surprised. Large as was the circle of Merville's acquaintances, neither his personal popularity nor his standing as a financial authority could account for this overwhelming success. Merville himself discounted his own influence, not realizing that in the 25 years of professional life, he had built up a national reputation. His name had been a household word since his treatment of a foreign royalty whose case had been regarded by native physicians as hopeless. This may not have been a complete explanation. Probably the fact that the stock in the cold storage company stood at a premium had something to do with the rush for consolidated deeps. The new company did not pay dividends, but long before the first was due, Mr. Stepp had launched 2 others. On paper, Dr. Merville made a fortune. Actually, he acquired heavy liabilities, not the least of which was his heavy participation in a private flotation which Mr. Stepp, with unconscious humor, labeled the Investment Salvage Syndicate. It was a stockholding company, and in the main it held such stock as a general public declined to purchase. There are rules of behavior which normal people do not transgress. A gentleman does not search the overcoat pockets of his fellow clubmen and confiscate such valuables as he may find, nor does he steal into the houses of people he does not know and remove their silver. A corporation man has a less rigid code. Dr. Merville found himself consciously assisting in the manipulation of a stock, a manipulation which could only be intended to deprive stockholders of their legitimate rights. There was one unpleasant moment of doubt and shame when Merville sought to disentangle his individuality from this corporative existence. He tried to think singly, applying the tests which had governed his life. He found it easier to divide his responsibility. Somehow he felt less venal when only a 14th of the blame attached to him. This fraction represented his holding in consolidated deeps. Wealth is an effective narcotic. Rich and fearless men can find a melancholy pleasure in the contemplation of their past sins. But poverty and the danger of poverty acts as a microphone through the medium of which the still small voice of conscience is a savage roar. Beryl thought he was unusually nervous when she went to find him in his study. He started at the sound of her voice. "Ready? Yes, dear. What time did Stepp say?" 8 o'clock. "We have plenty of time, Father. The car isn't here yet. Do you know whether Ronnie will be there?" Dr. Merville was looking abstractedly at her. His mind, she knew, was very far away. "Ronnie? I don't know. John Maxton will be there. I saw him today. Stepp admires him, and John is clever. He will be a judge one of these days." "Yes, a judge." The little grimace he made was involuntary. "One would think you expected to meet him in his official capacity," she laughed. "Absurd, of course. As to Ronnie, how do you feel about him, Beryl?" The maid tapped at the door to say the car had arrived. Beryl answered, "Do you mean?" "I don't quite know what you do mean." "About the scandal. Do you remember a man who came to see you? Why he should have come to you, I don't know, with a story about his sister. East was the name. Yes, Ronnie told me all about it. The man is a blackmailer, and his sister was not much better. Ronnie had shown a kindness to the girl. He met her at some mission or other. Ronnie does queer things like that. And he gave her some money to go on a holiday. That was all. Freddie. But, Daddy, don't you believe Ronnie?" She was desperately anxious to consolidate her own faith. "I don't know. Ronnie is a queer fellow." He was ready to go. His overcoat was over his arm, and yet he lingered. She guessed he would say something more about Ronald Morrell and was stiffening to defend him, but she was mistaken. "Beryl, you are 22 and very beautiful. I may be biased, but I hardly think I am. I have seen many lovely women in my life, and you could hold your own with any of them. Do you ever think of getting married? She tried hard to control herself, but the color in her face deepened and faded. I haven't thought much about it, she said. There are two parties to a marriage, Daddy. Are you fond of anybody? I mean, are you, in your heart, committed to any one man? A pause, then no. I'm glad, said her father, relieved. Very glad. You must look for something in a man which fellows like Ronnie Morel can never give to a woman. Power, fortune, mental strength, and stability. Come along. She followed him to the car, dumb with astonishment, but not at that moment apprehensive. She knew that he had been talking of Jan Stepp. Chapter 6. Mr. Stepp had a house in Berkeley Square which he rented from its lordly owner. Beryl had dined there before, and it had been a baffling experience, for in no respect did the personality of the tenant find an opportunity of expressing itself. The furnishings and the color schemes of the landlord had been left as they had been found, and since the atmosphere of the place was late Victorian, Mr. Stepp was unconformable to his surroundings. Beryl thought of him as a sultan amidst samplers. Sir John Maxton was talking to him when they were announced. One of the greatest advocates at the bar, Maxton was tall, slender, aesthetic. His gentle manner had led many a confident witness into trouble. He had a reputation at the bar as a just and merciless man, a master of the art of cross-examination. The doctor told me you were likely to be here, he said, when she had escaped from Stepp's thunderous civilities. I hope Ronnie would have come. Have you seen him lately? Only for a few minutes on Monday. I met him in the park. I didn't know you were a friend of his, Sir John. Maxton's lips curled. Beryl wondered if he was trying to smile, or whether that twitch indicated something uncomplimentary to Ronnie. I'm more than a friend, unless I was one of the executors of his father's will. Old Bennett Morel was my first client, and I suppose I stand in loco parentis to Ronnie by virtue of my executorship. I have not seen him for quite a year. Somebody told me that he was scribbling. He always had a bent that way. It is 1,000 pities he didn't take the law seriously. An occupation would have kept him out of mischief. Has Ronnie been called to the bar? She asked in astonishment. Maxton nodded. Just before the war, but he has never practiced. I hope that the newspaper connection will keep him busy. But Ronnie works very hard, she asserted stoutly. He has his company work. He's a director of several and chairman of one, I believe. Maxton looked at her with the faintest shade of amusement in his eyes. Of course, he said drily, that is an occupation. He lowered his voice. Do you mind if I am ill-bred and ask you if you have known our host very long? A few years. He nodded. Beryl, glancing across at her father and Stepp, saw that the doctor was talking earnestly. She caught Stepp's gaze and looked back to Sir John. I have been fighting a case for him. Rather a hopeless proposition, but we won. The jury was wrong, I think, in giving us a verdict. I can say this because the other side have entered an appeal which is certain to succeed. Jan Stepp must have heard the last sentence. Huh? Succeed? Yes, perhaps. It doesn't matter very much. I had a verdict. A disqualified winner is still a moral winner. Huh, doctor? You used to be a racing man. What do you think? Dinner was announced whilst the doctor was disclaiming any knowledge of the turf or its laws. The dinner was exquisite in its selection and brevity. Mr. Stepp had one special course which none of the others shared. He invited them and showed no regret when they refused. A footman brought a silver dish piled high with steaming mealy cobs. He took them in his hands and gnawed at the hot corn. It was probably the only way that mealies could be eaten, she told herself. No more inelegant an exhibition than the sword-swallowing man, overo which followed the serving of asparagus. Salt? Mr. Stepp was wiping his fingers on his serviette. You asked me once before, Beryl. Where was it? In the park. No, I haven't seen him. I very seldom do. Strange man, huh? The butler had attended more frequently to Dr. Merville's wine glass than to any other of the guests. His gloom had disappeared, and he was more like the cheerful man Beryl remembered. Salt is a danger and a menace to society, he said. Stepp's brows lowered, but he did not interrupt. At the same time, he can exercise one of the most beneficent forces that nature has ever given into the care of a human being. You pique my curiosity, said Maxton, interested. Is he psychic or clairvoyant? From your tone, one would imagine that he had some supernatural power. He has, nodded Merville. I discovered it some time ago. He lodges with a woman named Colebrook in a very poor part of the town. Mrs. Colebrook suffers from an unusual form of heart disease. She had a seizure one night, and Salt came for me. You will remember, dear, when I was called out in the middle of the night a year ago. The moment I examined the woman, who was unconscious, and in my opinion an extremist, I knew that nothing could be done. I applied the remedies which I had brought with me, and which I had thought, from his description of the seizure, would be necessary, but with no effect. Salt was terribly upset. The woman had 2 daughters, one bedridden. His grief at the thought that she would die without her daughters seeing her was tragic. I think he was going upstairs to bring the girl down, when I said casually that if I could lend the patient strength to live for another hour, she would probably recover. What followed seems to me even now as part of a fantastic dream. Beryl's elbow was on the table, her chin in her palm, and she was absorbed. Maxton lay back, his arm hanging over the back of his chair, weighing every word. His hands clasped on the table, his head bent, skeptical. Salt bent down and took the inert hands of the woman in his. Just held them. Remember this, that she was the color of the serviette, her lips gray. I wondered what he was doing. I don't know now. Only her face went gradually pink, and her eyes opened. How long after he took her hands? Asked Maxton. Less than a minute, I should think. As I say, she opened her eyes and looked around, and then she nodded very slowly. What do you think of that, Dr. Merville? She said. She knew you, of course? She had never seen me in her life. I learned that afterwards. Salt dropped her hands and stood up. He was looking ghastly, not a vestige of color. I said to him, Salt, what is the matter? And he answered in a Cockney whine that was H-less and ungrammatical. Salt never makes an error in that respect. It's me, sir. I get them attacks at times. Aneurysm. Salt? Stepp's face was puckered into a grimace of incredulity. Go on, please, father, urged the girl. What came after was even more curious. Mrs. Colebrook got up quite unaided, sat down in a chair before the fire, and fell fast asleep. Salt sat down too. I gave him some brandy, and he seemed to recover. But he did not speak again, not even to answer my questions. He sat bolt upright in a wooden chair by the side of the kitchen table. All this happened in the kitchen. He didn't move for a long time, and then his hands began to stray along the table. There was a big work basket at the other side, and presently his hands reached it, and he drew it toward him. I watched him. He took out some garment. I think it was a night dress belonging to one of the girls. It was unfinished, and the needle was sticking into it. He began to sew. Good God, cried Maxton. Do you suggest that on the touching of hands the 2 identities changed? I assert that, said the doctor quietly, and drank his wine. Rubbish, growled Step. What did Salt say about it? I will tell you. Exactly an hour after this extraordinary transference had been made, I saw Mrs. Colebrook going pale. She opened her eyes and looked at me in a puzzled way, then at the daughter, a pretty child who had been present all the time. I always ave these attacks, sir, she said. A aneurysm, the doctors call it. And Salt? He was himself again, but distressingly tired and wan. Did he explain? The doctor shook his head. He didn't understand or remember much. The next day, out of curiosity, I called at the house and asked him if he could sew. He was amused. He said that he had never used a needle in his life. His hands were too big. Beryl sat back with a sigh. It doesn't seem human, she said. The doctor had opened his mouth to reply when there was a crash in the hall outside, and the sound of a high, aggressive voice. Another second, and the door was thrown violently open, and the man lurched in. He was hatless, and his frock coat was covered with the coffee-colored stains of wet mud. His cravat was awry, and the ends hung loose over his unbuttoned waistcoat. A stray lock of black hair hung over his narrow forehead. He strode into the center of the room, and with legs apart, one hand on his hip and the other caressing his long, brown beard, he surveyed the company with a sardonic smile. "Hail, thieves and brother bandits," he said thickly. He spoke with a slight lisp. "Hail, head devil and chief of the tribe. Hail, Helen." Step was on his feet, his head thrust forwards, his shoulders bent. Maxton saw him and started. There was something feline in that crouching attitude. "You drunken fool," How dare you come here, huh? Mr. Meropulos snapped his fingers contemptuously. I come because I have the right, he said with drunken gravity. Who will deny the Prime Minister the right of calling upon the king? He bowed and nearly lost his balance, recovering by the aid of a chairback. Go to my study, Meropulos. I will come out with you. Step had gained control of himself, but the big frame was trembling with pent rage. Study, bah! Here is my study. Hail, doctor, man of obnoxious drafts. Hail, stranger. Whoever you are, where's the immaculate Ronnie? Flower of English chivalry and warrior of a million flights. Huh. He bellowed his imitation of Step's grunt and chuckled with laughter. Now listen, Confederates, I have done with you all. I'm going to live honest. Why? I will tell you. Meropulos. Beryl turned quickly toward the door. She knew before she saw the stolid figure that it was Salt. Meropulos turned too. Ah, the faithful Ambrose. Do you want me, Salt? His tone was mild. He seemed to wilt under the steady gaze of the man in the doorway. Ambrose Salt beckoned, and the drunken intruder shuffled out, shamefaced, fearful. Quite an interesting evening, said Sir John Maxton as he closed the car door on the Mervilles that night. Chapter 7. 2 days later, Sir John Maxton made an unexpected call upon the doctor, and it occurred to him that he might also have made an unwelcome appearance, for he interrupted a tete-a-tete. I thought I should find the doctor in. Well, Ronnie, how are you after all these years? Ronnie was relieved to see him. That was the impression which the lawyer received. And Beryl, although she was her sweet, equable self, would gladly have excused his presence. Maxton had an idea that he had surprised them in the midst of a quarrel. The girl was flushed, and her eyes were unusually bright. Ronnie's countenance was clouded with gloom. Sir John was sensitive to atmosphere. No, I really won't stay. I wanted to have a chat with the doctor about the extraordinary story he told us the other night. I was dining with the Lord Chief and some other judges last night, and, without mentioning names, of course, I repeated the story. They were remarkably interested. Barham says that he had heard of such a case. What is all this about? Asked Ronnie curiously. You didn't tell me anything, Beryl. Who? What and where is the case? Mr. Salt, she said shortly. Oh, Salt? He is an extraordinary fellow. I must meet him. They say that he cannot read or write. Is that a fact? Sir John Maxton looked at the girl. Yes, I believe so. Ronnie, on the contrary, is in the way of becoming a famous writer, Sir John. So I hear. He wondered why she had so deliberately and so abruptly brought the conversation into another channel. Ronald Morrell, for his part, was not inclined to let the subject drift. It is quaint how that coon intrigues you all, he said. Oh yes, he is colored. You haven't seen him, John, or you wouldn't ask that question. I have seen him. It did not appear to me that he was colored. He has a striking face. At any rate, he seems to have struck you and Beryl all of a heap, said Ronnie, smiling. Really, I must meet him. Are you going, Sir John? Maxton was taking his farewell of the girl. Because if you are, I'll walk a little way with you. Bye, Beryl. Goodbye, Ronnie, she said quietly. Once in the street, Maxton asked, What is the matter with you and Beryl? Nothing. Beryl is just a little grandmotherly. She went to the theater last night with some people, and she spotted me in a box. I see, said Sir John drily. And of course you were not alone in the box. Why on earth should I be? Demanded the other. Beryl is really unreasonable. She swore that my friend was a girl she had seen me with in the park. And who was it? Is that a discreet question? No, it isn't, said Ronnie instantly. I don't think one ought to chuck names about. It is most dishonorable and caddish. The lady was a very great friend of mine. Then I probably know her, said Sir John, willfully dense. I know most of the people in your set, and I cannot imagine that you would be scoundrel enough to escort the kind of girl you couldn't introduce to me, or Beryl, or any other of your friends. I give you my word of honor, Ronnie was earnest, that the lady was not only presentable, but is known personally to you. The fact is that she had a row with her fiancé, a man I know very well, a Coldstreamer, and I was doing no more than trying to reconcile them, bring them together, you understand. She was dreadfully depressed, and I got a box at the theater with the idea of cheering her up. My efforts, he added virtuously, were successful. Beryl said that it was a girl, the daughter of a dear friend of mine. She had seen me talking with in the park. What dear friend of yours was this? I don't think you've met him, parried Ronnie. Did she have trouble with her fiancé, too? Asked Sir John innocently. Really, Ronnie, you are coming out strong as a disinterested friend of distressed virgins. If I may employ the imagery and language of an American burglar whom I recently defended, Sir Galahad has nothing on you. You don't believe me, John, said Ronnie, injured. Of course I cannot believe you. I'm not a child. You had some girl with you, some pickup, innocent or guilty, God knows. I will assume her innocence. The sophisticated have no appeal for you. There was a girl named East, a chorus girl, if I remember rightly. If you're going to talk about that disgraceful attempt to blackmail me, I'm finished, said Ronnie, resigned. Why didn't you charge her and her brother with blackmail? They came to me. Good Lord, did they? I'll break that infernal blackguard's neck. When will you meet him? Ronnie did not answer. They came to me, and I knew that the story was true. The brother, of course, is a blackmailer. He is levying blackmail now, and you are paying him. Don't argue, Ronnie. Of course you are paying him. You said just now that you would break his neck, which meant to me that you see him frequently when he comes to draw his blood money. If it were a case of blackmail, why did you not prosecute? The mere threat of the prosecution would have been sufficient to have sent him to ground. It struck me that the girl was acting under the coercion of her brother, and I do not think you would have had any trouble from her. Ronnie, you are rotten. He said this as he stopped at the corner of Park Lane and Piccadilly, and Ronnie smiled nervously. Oh, come now, John. That is rather a strong expression. Rotten, repeated the lawyer. He screwed a monocle in his eye and surveyed his companion dispassionately. Chorus girls, shop girls, the mechanics of joy who serve Madame Riddy. That made you jump, eh? I know quite a lot about you. They are your life. And God gave you splendid gifts and the love of the sweetest, dearest girl in this land. Who is this? Asked the young man slowly. Beryl. You do not need to be told that. Search the ranks of your light women for her beauty, Ronnie. A girl passed them, a wisp of a girl on the borderline of womanhood. She carried a little bag and was hurrying home from the store where she was employed. Even as he listened to the admonition of his companion, Ronnie caught her eyes and smiled into them. She paused and looked round once. He was still watching her. I am afraid I must leave you, John. I've a lot of work to do, and you are quite mistaken as to my character. And Beryl. He left the lawyer abruptly and walked toward the gates of the park where the girl had stopped, ostensibly to tie a shoelace. Sir John saw her pass leisurely into the park. A few seconds later, Ronnie had followed. His time was his own, for Evie Colebrook was working that evening. The annual stock-taking was in progress, as she had told him when they were at the theater on the previous night. Rotten, repeated Maxton, and stalked gloomily to his club. Chapter 8. Mr. Ronald Morell's flat was on the third floor of a block that faced busy Knightsbridge. His library was a large and airy room at the back, and from the open casements commanded an uninterrupted view of the park. It was a pleasant room with its rows of bookshelves and its chintzes. The silver fireplace and the rich Persian rugs which covered the parquet were the only suggestions of luxury. There were one or two pictures which Francois had an order to remove when certain visitors were expected. The rest were decent reproductions with the exception of a large oil painting above the mantelpiece. It was a St. Anthony and was attributed to Tiziano Vecellio. The austere saint loomed darkly from a somber background and was represented as an effeminate youth. The veining of the neck and shoulders was characteristically Titian. So too was the inclination of a marble column, which showed faintly in the picture. Tiziano's inability to draw a true vertical line is well known, and upon this column, more than upon other evidence, the experts accepted the picture as an early example of the fortunate painter's work. Ronnie was indifferent as to the authenticity of the picture. The dawning carnality on Anthony's lean face, the misty shape of the temptress, Titian or his disciple had reduced to visibility the doubt, the gloating, and the very thoughts of the saint. A black oak table stood in the center of the room, and a deep Medici writing chair was placed opposite the black blotting pad. It pleased Ronnie to imitate those ministers of state who employed this color to thwart curious-minded servants who, with the aid of a mirror, might discover the gist of outward correspondence. It was nearing midnight when the sound of Ronnie's key in the lock sent his sleepy servant into the lobby. Ronnie stood in the hall, tenderly stripping his gloves. Has anybody been? No, monsieur. Letters? Only one, monsieur. An account. He opened the library door, and Ronnie walked in. He switched on the light of his desk lamp and sat down. I have not been out all the evening, Francois. No, monsieur. I came home after dinner, and I have not left this room. Do you understand? Perfectly, monsieur. Have we any iodine? Look for it, damn you, don't gape. Francois hurried out to inspect the contents of the bathroom locker, where were stored such first aid remedies as were kept in the flat. Ronnie looked at his hand and pulled back the cuff of his coat. 3 ugly red scratches ran from the wrist to the base of the middle fingers. His lips pursed angrily. Little beast, he said. Well, there is a bottle. Would monsieur like a bandage? It is not necessary. Have you a cat in the flat? No, we'll get one tomorrow. You need not keep it permanently. I don't think there will be any trouble. Bring me a hand mirror from my dressing table. Hurry. He lifted the shade from the table lamp and, in the mirror, examined his face carefully. His right cheek was red. He imagined finger marks, but the fine skin had not been torn. I have had a quarrel with a lady, Francois. A common girl. I do not think she will make any further trouble, but if she does not know me anyway. Ronald's lovemaking had ended unpleasantly, and he had left the dark aisles of the park in a hurry before the scream of a frightened girl had brought the police to the spot. I was expecting monsieur to telephone me saying that I might go home, said Francois. He lodged in Kensington, and sometimes it was convenient for Ronnie that he should go home early. 2 women came in the morning to clean the flat, and he usually arrived in time to carry in his master's breakfast from the restaurant attached to the building. No, I didn't telephone. Take this glass back and bring me the evening newspapers. That is all. You can clear out. When the front door closed upon his valet, Ronnie got up and, walking to the window, pulled aside the curtains. The casement was open, and he sat down on the padded window seat, looking out into the darkness. He was not thinking of his night's adventure, being something of a philosopher. The sordidness and the vulgarity of it would not distress him in any circumstances. He was thinking of Beryl and what John Maxton had said. He knew that she liked him, but he had made no special effort to foster her affection or to evolve from their relationship one more intimate. By his code, she was taboo. Lovemaking with Beryl could only lead to marriage, and matrimony was outside of his precarious plans. It pleased him to ponder upon Beryl. Perhaps she was in love with him. He had not considered the possibility before. That women only differed by the hats they wore was a working rule of his. But it was strange that the influence he exercised was common to girls so widely separated by birth, education, and taste as Beryl was from Evie Colebrook, and others. Self-disparagement was the last weakness to be expected in Ronald Morel, and yet it was true to say that he had restricted his hunting for so long to one variety of game that he doubted his ability to follow another. His father had been an enthusiastic hawker, one of the remaining few who followed the sport of kings, and Ronnie invariably thought of his adventuring in terms of falconry. He was a hawk, and seemed a hawk that swung on its rigid sails, waiting on until the quarry was sprung. Sometimes the quarry was not taken without talons to rend and tear at the embarrassed falcon. He felt the wounds on his hand gingerly. But a trained hawk respects the domestic fowl. Even the folk of the dovecot may coo at peace whilst he waits on in the sky. Beryl? She was certainly lovely. Her figure was delectable, and her mouth, red and full. A Rossetti woman should not have such lips. Was it Rossetti who painted those delicately featured women? He got up and found a big portfolio filled with prints. Yes, it was Rossetti, but Beryl's figure was incomparably more delicious than any woman's that the painter had drawn. He came back to the window, staring out into the night, until in the gray of dawn, the outline of trees emerged from the void. Then he went to bed and to sleep. He did not move for 5 hours, and then he woke with a horrible sense of desolation. He blinked round the room, and at that instant the clock of a church began to strike. The quarters sounded, a pause. Toll, 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 toll. 9 o'clock. With a scream of fear, he leaped out of bed, sweating, panic-stricken, forlorn. 9 o'clock. No, no, Christ, no. Francois, an early arrival, heard his voice and rushed in. Monsieur, he gasped. Ronald Morel was sitting on his bed, sobbing into his hands. "A nightmare, Francois, a nightmare. Get out, blast you!" But he had had no nightmare, could recall nothing of dreams, though he strove all day, his head throbbing. Only he knew that to hear 9 o'clock striking had seemed very dreadful. Chapter 9. "I saw your friend Ronald Morel today," said Meropulos, sending a writhing ring of smoke to the ceiling. Sprawling on a big Morris chair, his slippered feet resting on the edge of a fender, he watched the circle break against the ceiling. A pair of stained gray flannel trousers, a silk shirt, and a velvet coat that had once been a vivid green. These, and an immense green silk cravat, the color of which showed through his beard, constituted his usual morning negligee. Ambrose Salt, busy with the body of an unfinished safe, which in the rough had come from the maker's hands that morning, released the pressure of his acetylene lamp and removed his goggles before he replied. He was working in shirt and trousers, and his sleeves were rolled up, displaying the rope-like muscles of his arm. He looked across to his indolent companion and wiped the perspiration from his forehead. "Mr. Ronald Morel is neither a friend nor an acquaintance, Meropulos. I don't think I have ever seen him. I have heard of him. You haven't missed much by not knowing him," said Meropulos, "but he's a good-looking fellow." He flicked the ash of his cigarette onto the tiled hearth. "Stepp is still annoyed with me." Salt smiled to himself. "You think he is justified?" "Perhaps. I was terribly drunk, but I was happy. Someday, my dear brother, I shall get so drunk that even you will not hold me. I move towards my apotheosis of intoxication, certainly and surely. Then I will be irresistible, and I shall have no fear of those brute arms of yours." He sucked at the cigarette without speaking for a long time. Salt went back to his work. "I have often wondered," said Meropulos at last. "What?" "Whether it would have been better if I had followed the advice of my head man that morning I pulled you aboard the sloop. You remember Bob, the Kanaka boy? He wanted to knock you on the head and drop you overboard. You were too dangerous, he said. If a government boat had picked us up and you had been found on board as well as certain other illicit properties, I should have had a double charge against me. I said no because I was sorry for you. Because you were afraid of me," said Salt calmly. "I knew you were afraid when I looked into your eyes." "Why do you speak of the islands now? We haven't talked about the Pacific since I left the boat." "I've been thinking about you," confessed Meropulos with a quick, sly glance at the man. "Do you realize how not curious? What is the word?" "Incurious," suggested Salt, and Meropulos looked at him with reluctant admiration. "You are an extraordinary hombre, Salt. Merville says you have the vocabulary, that is English or something like it, of an educated man. But to return, do you realize how incurious I am? For example, I have never once asked you, in all our years of knowing one another, why you killed that man." "Which man?" Meropulos laughed softly. "Butcher. Have you killed so many?" "I refer to the victim for whose destruction the French government sent you to New Caledonia." Salt stood leaning his back against the table, his eyes fixed on the floor. "He was a bad man," he said simply. "I tried to find another way of stopping him, but he was clever and he had powerful friends who were government officials. So I killed him. He hired 2 men to wait for me one night. I was staying at a little hotel on the Plassey Road. They tried to beat me because I had reported this man. Then I knew that the only thing I could do was to kill him. I should do it again." Meropulos surveyed him from under his lowered brows. "You were lucky to escape the widow, my friend," he said, but Ambrose shook his head. "Nobody was executed in those days. Capital punishment had not been abolished, but the Senate refused to vote the executioner his salary. It had the same effect. I was lucky to go to New Caledonia. Cayenne is worse. How long did you serve?" 8 years and 7 months, was the reply. Meropulos made a little grimace. "I would sooner die," he said and lit another cigarette. Deep in thought he smoked until Ambrose made a move to pick up his Crook's glasses. "Don't work. I hate to see you, and hate worse to hear you. What do you think of Morel?" "I don't know him. I have heard about him. He is not a good man." "What is a good man?" Meropulos demanded contemptuously. "He is a lover of ladies, who isn't? He is a cur too. Stepp walks on him. He is scared of Stepp, but then everybody is except you and I." Ambrose smiled. "Well, perhaps I am. He is such a gorilla. But you are not. Why should I be? I am stronger than he. Meropulos looked at the man's bare arms. Yes, I suppose it comes down to that. The basis of all fear is physical. When will the safe be finished? In a week. I am assembling the lock at home. I shall make it work to 5 letters. The only word I can spell. I shouldn't have known that, but I heard a man spell it once, on the ship that brought me home. He was a steerage passenger, and he used to take his little child on the deck when it was fine, and the little one used to read scripture stories to him. When she came to a hard word, he spelled it. I heard one word and never forgot it. I'll be glad when the thing is finished, the Greek meditated. We have a whole lot of papers that we never want to see the light of day, Step and I. We could destroy them, but they may be useful, correspondence that it isn't safe to keep and it isn't wise to burn. You are an ingenious devil. In the Paddington Directory, against Meropulos, 49, Junction Terrace, were the words, mining engineer. It was a courtesy status, for he had neither mined nor engineered. Probably the people of Junction Terrace were too occupied with their own strenuous affairs to read the directory. They knew him as one who at irregular periods was brought home in the middle of the night, singing noisily in a strange language. Cicero's oration was Greek to Cassius. The melodious gibberish of Mr. Meropulos was Greek to Junction Terrace, though they were not aware of the fact. Number 49 was a gaunt, damp house with a mottled face, for the stucco had peeled in patches and had never been renewed. Meropulos bought it at a bargain price and made no contingency allowance for dilapidations. The windows of the upper floors were dingy and unwashed. The owner argued that as he did not occupy the rooms above, it would be wicked waste of money to clean the windows. Similarly, he dispensed with carpets in the hall and on the stairs. His weekends he spent in more pleasing surroundings, for he had a cottage on the borders of Hampshire where he kept hens and grew cabbage roses and on Sundays loafed in his garden, generally in his pajamas, to the scandal of the neighborhood. He had a whimsical turn of mind and named his cottage the Parthenon, and supported this conceit by decorating his Arcadian groves with plaster reproductions of the great figures of mythology, such figures as Phidias and Polycletus and Praxiteles chiseled. He added to this a wooden pronaos, which the local builder misguidedly surmised was intended for the entrance to a new cinema. When they discovered that the erection had no other purpose than to remind Meropulos of departed Hellenic splendors, the grief of the villagers was pathetic. Here he was kept, reluctantly, tidy. He owned a small American car, which supplied him the transportation he required and made his country home accessible. It was Friday, the day he usually left town, but he had lingered on, hoping to see some tangible progress in the construction of the safe. "You never seem to get any further," he complained. "You have been fiddling with that noisy lamp for 2 hours, and so far as I can see, you've done nothing. How long will it be before anything happens?" And then before Salt could reply, he went on, "Why don't you come to my little Athens, Salt? You prefer to stay in town. And you are a man of brains. Have you a girl here?" "No." "Gee, what a time that fellow Ronnie must have. But they will catch him some day. A mad father or a lunatic fiancé, and ping, there will be Ronnie Morel's brains on the floor, and the advocates pleading the unwritten law. You seem to know a lot about him." Meropulos ran his fingers through his beard and grinned at the ceiling. "Yes, I can't know too much. We shall have trouble with him." Step laughs at the idea. "He has him bound to his heel. Is that the expression, no? Well, he has him like that. But how can you bind a liar or chain an eel? His very cowardice is a danger." "What have you to be afraid of?" asked Salt. "So far as I can make out, you are carrying on an honest business." "It must be, or the doctor wouldn't be in it." His tone was sharp and challenging. Meropulos had sufficient nous not to accept that kind of challenge. "I can understand that you have papers that you wish to keep in such a way that nobody but yourselves can get at them. All businesses have their secrets." "Quite so," agreed the Greek and yawned. "Ronnie will pay," he said, "but I am anxious that I should not be asked to contribute to the bill. I have had a great deal of amusement watching him. The other night I was in the park. I go there because he goes. I know the paths he uses. And there came with him a most pretty young lady. She did not know him. You guessed that? I know, because later, when she complained, she did not know his name. Ronnie, he mused. Now I tell you what I will undertake to do. I will make a list, accurate and precise, of all his love affairs. It will be well to know these, because there may come a day when it will be good to flourish a weapon in this young man's face. Such men marry rich women. Salt was working and only muttered his reply. He was not then interested in Ronnie Morel. Chapter 10. He stayed on in the house long after Meropulos had dragged himself to his room and had dressed for the journey. So absorbed was he in his task that the Greek left without his noticing. At 7 o'clock he finished, put away his tools in a cupboard, threw a cloth over the safe, and went out, locking the door behind him. Both Steppe and Meropulos had urged him to live in the house. But though he had few predilections that were not amenable to the necessities of his friends, Salt was firm on this point. He preferred the liberty which his lodgings gave him. Possibly, he foresaw the difficulties which might arise if he lived entirely with the Greek. Meropulos had a vicious and an uncertain tongue, was tetchy on some points, grotesquely so on the question of Greek decadence, although he had lived so long away from his native country that English was almost his mother tongue. Salt could be tactful, but he had a passion for truth, and the two qualities are often incompatible. A bus carried him to the end of the street where he lodged, and he stopped at a store on the corner and bought a box of biscuits for Christina. She was secretary and reader to him, and he repaid her services with a library subscription and such delicacies as she asked him to get for her. The subscription was a godsend to the girl, and augmented, as it was, by an occasional volume which Evie was allowed to bring from the store library by virtue of her employment. Her days were brightened, and her dreams took a wider range than ever. The driving force of learning is imagination. By imagination was Christina educated. Evie sometimes said that she did not understand one half of the words that Christina used. To Mrs. Colebrook, her daughter was an insoluble enigma. She associated education with brain fever and ideas above your station. And while she was secretly proud of the invalid's learning, she regarded Christina's spinal trouble as being partly responsible for the abnormality. Mrs. Colebrook believed in dreams and premonitions and the sinister significance of broken picture wires. It was part of her creed that people who are not long for this world possess supernatural accomplishments. Therefore, she eyed Christina's books askance and looked upon the extra library subscription as being a wild flight in the face of Providence. She expressed that view privately to Ambrose Salt. "You have come at a propitious moment, Salt Effendi," said Christina solemnly as he came in. "I have just been taking my last look at the silvery Bosphorus. My husband, taking offense at a kiss I threw to the handsome young sultan as he rose beneath my latticed window, has decreed that tonight I am to be tied in a sack and thrown into the dark waters." "Good gracious," said Ambrose. "You have been in trouble today, Christina." "Not very much. The journey was a lovely one. We went by way of Bergen, and thank you ever so much for that old Bradshaw you got for me. It was just the thing I wanted. Mr. Meropulos kindly gave it to me. Yes, Bergen. And then to Petrograd, the Tsars were there, poor people. And then to Odessa, and down the Black Sea, I don't know. It was a silly journey today, Ambrose. I wasn't in the heart for a holiday. Is your back any worse?" She shook her head. "No, it seems better. I nearly let myself dream about getting well. Do you think that other idea is possible? We can borrow a spinal carriage from the Institute, but Mother hasn't much time, and besides, I couldn't get down those narrow stairs without a lot of help." Yes. I know it is possible now. But the chariot, dear Ambrose, I've got it." He chuckled at her astonishment. "It will come tomorrow. It is rather like a motor car, for I have to find a garage for it. In this tiny house there is no room. But I got it. No, it didn't cost me a great deal. Dr. Merville told me where I could get one cheap. I put new tires on, and the springs are grand. Christina, you will be— Don't cry, Christina, please. You make me feel terrible." His agitation had the effect of calming her. "There must be something in this room that makes people weep." She gulped. "Ambrose, Evie is just worrying me to death. What is wrong?" She shook her red head helplessly. "I don't know. She is changed. She is old. She's such a kid, too, such a kid. If that man hurts her," the knuckles of her clenched hand showed bone white through the skin, "I'll ask you to do what you did for Mother. Ambrose, give me strength for an hour." Her voice sank to a husky whisper. "And I'll kill him. Kill him." Salt sat locking and unlocking his fingers, his eyes vacant. She will not be hurt. I wish I were sure it was Ronald Morell. Step as only to lift his finger. They heard the sound of Mrs. Colebrook's heavy feet on the stairs, and Christina wondered why she was coming up. She had never interrupted their little talks before. "Somebody to see you, Christina, and I'm sure it is too kind of you, miss, and please thank the doctor. I'll never be grateful enough for what he did." Ambrose Salt got up slowly to his feet as Beryl came into the room. "I wonder if you really mind my coming. I am Beryl Merville." "It is very good of you, Miss Merville," said Christina primly. She was ready to dislike her visitor. She hated the unknown people who called upon her, especially the people who brought jelly and fruit and last year's magazines. Their touching faith in the virtues of calf's foot and fruit as a panacea for human ills, their automatic cheerfulness and mechanical good humor, drove her wild. The church and its women had given up Christina ever since she had asked, in answer to the inevitable question. "Yes, there are some things I want. I'd like a box of perfumed cigarettes, some marron glacé, and a good English translation of Liaisons d'Angerieux." She loathed marron glacé, and scented tobacco was an abomination. Her chief regret was that the shocked inquirer had never heard of Liaisons d'Angerieux. Christina only knew of its existence from a reference in a literary weekly which came her way. Beryl sensed the hidden antagonism and the cause. "I really haven't come in a district visitor spirit," she said. "I'm not frightfully sorry for you, and I haven't brought you oranges." "Grapes," corrected Christina. "They give you appendicitis." Mother read that on the back page of Health Hints. "Sit down, Miss Merville. This is Mr. Salt." She nodded to Ambrose. "Mr. Salt and I are old acquaintances," she said. She did not look at him. "I have to explain why I came at all. I know that you are not particularly enthusiastic about stray visitors. Nobody is. But my father was talking about you at lunch today. He has never seen you, but Mr. Salt has spoken about you, and of course, he does know your mother." And father said, "Why don't you go along and see her, Beryls?" I said, "She would probably be very annoyed, but I'll take her that new long wordy novel that is so popular. I'm sure she'll hate it as much as I." "If it is Let the World Go, I'm certain I shall," said Christina promptly, "but I'd love to read it. Let us sneer together." Beryl laughed and produced the book. It seemed an appropriate moment for Ambrose to retire, and he went out of the room quietly. He thought that neither of the girls saw him go, but he was mistaken. Christina Colebrook was sensitive to his every movement, and Beryl had really come to the house to see him. On her way home, she tried to arraign herself before the bar of intelligence, but it was not until she was alone in her room that night that she set forth the stark facts of her folly. She loved Ronald Morell, loved him with an intensity which frightened her, loved him, although he was, according to all standards by which men are judged, despicable. He was a coward, a liar, a slave to his baser appetites. She had no doubt in her mind, when she faced the truth, that the stories which had been told of him were true. The East girl, the pretty parlor maid who had begun an action against him. And yet there was something infinitely pathetic about Ronald Morell, something that made her heart go out to him. Or was that a case of self-deception too? Was it not the beautiful animal she loved, the sleek, lithe tiger, alive and vital and remorseless? To all that was brain and spirit in her, he was loathsome. There were periods when she hated him and was bitterly contemptuous of herself. And in these periods came the soft voice of Ambrose Salt, whispering, insinuating. That was lunacy too. He was old enough to be her father, was an illiterate workman, an ex-convict, a murderer. When her father had told her he had killed a man, she was neither shocked nor surprised. She had guessed, from his brief reference to New Caledonia, that he had lived on that island under duress. He must have been convicted of some great crime. She could not imagine him in any mean or petty role. A coarse-handed workman, shabby of attire. It was madness to dream and dream of him as she did. And dreams, so Freud had said, were the expressions of wishes unfulfilled. What did she wish? She was prepared to answer the question frankly if any answer could be framed. But she had no ultimate wish. Her dreams of Ambrose Salt were unfinishable. Their ends ran into unfathomable darkness. "I wonder if he is very fond of that red-haired girl?" she asked her mirror. Contemplating such a possibility, she experienced a pang of jealousy and hated herself for it. Jan Stepp came back from Paris on the eve of her birthday. He called at the house the next morning before she was down and interviewed Dr. Merville. When Beryl went into breakfast, 2 little packages lay on her plate. The first was a diamond shawl pin. "You are a dear, Daddy." She went round the table and kissed him. "It is beautiful, and I wanted one badly." She hurried back to her place. Perhaps Ronnie had remembered? She picked up the card that was enclosed and read it. "Mr. Stepp?" Her father shot a quick glance at her. "Yes, bought it in Paris. He came in person to present it, but left when he found that you were not down. Rather pretty." This was an inadequate description of the beautiful plaque that flashed and glittered from its velvet bed. "It is lovely," she said, but without warmth. "Ought I accept? It is a very expensive present." "Why not? Stepp is a good friend of ours. Besides, he likes you," said the doctor, not looking up from his plate. "He would be terribly hurt if you didn't take it. In fact, you cannot very well refuse." She ran through her letters. There was a note from Ronnie, an invitation to a first night. He said nothing about her birthday. "Oh, by the way, some flowers came. I told Dean to put them in your room. I have been puzzling my head to remember when I told him the date of your birthday. I suppose I must have done so. And of course, he has the most colossal memory." "Who, father?" "Salt. He must have got up very early and gone to the market to get them. Very decent of him." She went out of the room with an excuse and found her maid in the pantry. She had filled a big bowl with the roses. There were so many that only room for half of them had been found. "The others I will put in the doctor's room, miss," said the maid. "Put them all in my room, every one of them," demanded Beryl. She selected 3 and fastened them in her belt before she went back to the breakfast room. The doctor laughed. "I've never seen you wearing flowers before. Salt would be awfully pleased." This she knew. That was why she wore them. Chapter 11. Evie Colebrook came home at an unusually early hour, and the girl on the bed looked up in surprise. "I heard Mother talking to somebody, but I had no idea it was you, Evie. What is the matter? Has your swain another engagement?" "My swain, as you call him, is working tonight," said Evie, "and it is so hot that I thought I would come home and get into my pajamas." "Mother has been talking about your eccentric tastes, with particular reference to pajamas," said Christina. "She thinks that pajamas are indelicate. In her young days, girls weren't supposed to have legs. Father wore pajamas. Father also drank. Mother thinks that the pajamas had something to do with it. She also thinks that book reading was a contributory cause." "What terrible jaw-breaking words you use, Christina. Father did read a lot, didn't he?" "Father was a student. He studied, amongst other things, race horses." "Do you know who Father was?" Evie stared at her expectantly. "He was a carpenter, wasn't he? He was the youngest son of a lord." "Take that look off your face, Evie. There is no possibility of our being the rightful heiresses of the old hall." "But it is true. He had a coat of arms. Then why did he marry Mother?" "Why do people marry anybody?" demanded Christina. "Why did Grandfather marry Grandmother? Besides, why shouldn't he have married Mother? He was only a cabinet maker when he met her. She has told me so. And his father was a parson, and his mother the Honorable Mrs. Colebrook, the daughter of Lord Fanshelm. There is blue blood in your veins, Evie." "But really, Christina," Evie's voice was eager and her eyes bright, "you are not fooling. Is it true? It makes such an awful difference." Christina groaned. "My God, what have I said?" she asked dramatically. "But really, Christina, you are related so distantly to nobility that you can hardly see it without a telescope," said Christina. "I thought you knew. Mother used always to be talking about it at one time." "My dear, what difference does it make?" Evie was silent. "A man doesn't love a girl anymore because she has a 5th cousin in the House of Lords. He doesn't love her any less because her mother takes in laundry, and if her lowly origin stands in the way of his marriage, and he finds that really she is the great-granddaughter of a princess, he cannot obliterate her intermediate relations." "What's intermediate?" "Well, Mother and Father, and the parson who got into trouble through drinking, and his wife who ran away with a groom." Evie drew a long sigh. "Where is your swain?" she asked. "I don't like that word swain. It sounds so much like swine." "I hope you will never see the resemblance any clearer," said Christina. "My swain is working too. I shouldn't take off that petticoat if I were you, Evie. He may come in and you can see your knickers through that dressing gown." "Christina, I hate mentioning knickers to a pure-minded girl, said Christina, fanning herself with a paper. But sisters have no secrets from one another. Ambrose, if that is who you mean, is very busy these days. Do you call him Ambrose to his face? Asked Evie curiously, and her sister snorted. Would you call Julius Caesar Bill or Julie to his face? Of course not. But I can't think of him as Ambrose Salt, Esquire. Can I? I don't understand him, said Evie. He seems so dull and quiet. I'll get him to jazz with you the next time you're home early, said Christina sardonically. Don't be so silly. Naturally, he isn't very lively being so old. Old! He is lively enough to carry me downstairs as though I were a pillow and wheel me for hours at a time in that glorious chariot he got for me. And he is old enough. But what is the good of talking to you, Evie? Presently her irritation passed, and she laughed. Tell me the news of the great world, Evie. What startling happenings have there been in Knightsbridge? I can tell you something about Mr. Salt you don't know, Evie was piqued into saying. He has been in prison. Christina turned on her side with a wince of pain. Say that again. He has been in prison. A long pause. I hoped he had, Christina said at last. I believe in imprisonment as an essential part of a man's education. Who told you? I'm not going to say. Ronald Morell? Ah. She pointed an accusing finger at the dumbfounded Evie. I know your guilty secret. The Ronnie you babble about in your sleep is Ronnie Morell. What makes you? It isn't true. It is a damned lie. Don't be profane, Evie. That is the worst of druggist shops. You pick up such awful language. Mother says you can't work amongst pills without getting ideas in your head. I never talk in my sleep. And I don't know Ronnie Morell. Who is he? Evie's ignorance was badly assumed. Christina became very thoughtful. She lay with her hand under her cheek, her gray eyes searching her sister's face. Would Ronnie be impressed by your distant relationship with nobility? She asked quietly. Would it make such an awful difference if he knew about the coat of arms in Father's Bible? I don't think it would. If it did, he isn't worth worrying about. What is he? Didn't Mr. Salt tell you? Asked Evie hotly. He seems to spend his time gossiping about people who are a million times better than him. Then he, murmured Christina, her eyes closed. He is a nasty, scandal-mongering old man. I hate him. He didn't say that Ronnie had been in prison. Christina's voice was gentle. All that he said was that the only Ronnie he knew was Ronald Morell. He did not even describe him or give him a character. How absurd, Christina! As if Old Salt could give Mr. Morell a character. One is a gentleman and the other is an old fossil. Old age is honorable, said Christina tolerantly. The arrogance of you babies. You're half in love with him. Holy, nodded Christina. I love his mind and his soul. I am incapable of any other kind of love. I never want a man to draw my flaming head to his shoulder and whisper that until he met me, the world was a desert and food didn't taste good. It is because Ambrose Salt never paws me or holds my hand or kisses me on the brow in the manner of a father who hopes to be something closer, that I love him. And I shall love him through eternity. When I am dead and he is dead, and I want nothing more than this. If he were to die tomorrow, I should not grieve because his flesh means nothing to me. The thing he gives me is everlasting. That is where I am better off than you, Evie. You have nothing but what you give yourself. You think he gives you these wonderful memories which keep you awake at nights. You think it is his love for you that thrills you. It isn't that, Evie. Your love is the love of the martyr who finds an ecstatic joy in his suffering. Groping toward understanding, Evie sees this illustration. God loves the martyr. It isn't one-sided, she quavered and Christina nodded. That is true, or it may be true. Does your God love you? It is blasphemous to talk of Ronnie as God. God with a small g dot. It is blasphemous anyhow. Ronnie does love me. He hasn't silly and conventional ideas about love as most people have. He is much broader-minded, but he does love me. I know it. A girl knows when a man loves her. That is one of the things she doesn't know, interrupted Christina. She knows when he wants her, but she doesn't know how continually he will want her. He is unconventional, too, and broad-minded. The broad-minded are usually people who take a generous view of their own shortcomings. Is he one of those unconventional souls who think that marriage is a barbarous ceremony? Who told you that? Evie was breathless from surprise. It isn't a unique view. Broad-minded men often try to get narrow-minded girls to see that standpoint. You're cynical. I hate cynical people, said Evie, throwing herself on her bed, and you have all your ideas of life out of books, and the rotten people who come in here moaning about their troubles. You can't believe writers. Not some writers. There are some, of course, that give just a true picture of life. Not in books, but in articles in the newspapers. They just seem to know what people are thinking and feeling, and express themselves wonderfully. Ah, so Ronnie writes for the newspapers, does he? Evie's indignant retort was checked by a knock on the door. That is Mr. Salt. Can he come in? I suppose so, answered Evie grudgingly. She got off the bed and tied her dressing gown more tightly. I don't really show my legs through this kimono, do I, Christina? Not unless you want to come in. Ambrose Salt looked tired. Just looked in before I went to my room, he said. Good evening, Evie. Good evening, Mr. Salt. Evie's dressing gown was wrapped so tightly as to give her a mummified appearance. I saw the osteopath today, and I've arranged for him to come and talk to you tomorrow, said Ambrose, sitting on the edge of the bed at the inviting gesture of Christina's hand. I will parley with him, she nodded. I don't believe that he will make a scrap of difference. I've seen all sorts of doctors and specialists. Mother has a list of them. She is very proud of it. I'm only hoping that this man may do you some good, said Ambrose, rubbing his chin meditatively. I have seen some wonderful cures in America. Even Dr. Merville believes in them. He says that if you build a skyscraper and the steel frame isn't true, you cannot expect the doors to shut or the windows to open. I'm sorry I'm so late, but the osteopath was dining out, and I had to wait until he came back. He hurt his ankle too, and that took time. I had to give him a rubbing. He is the best man in London. Dr. Duncan Moore. She did not take her eyes from his face. Evie noticed this and discounted Christina's earlier assertion. Will it cost a lot of money? Asked Christina. Not much, in fact, very little. The first examination is free. He doesn't really examine you, you know. He will just feel your back, through your clothes. I asked him that because I know how you dislike examinations. And if he doesn't think that you can be treated, and that there is a chance of making you better, he won't bother you anymore. I don't believe in these quack doctors, said Evie decidedly. They promise all sorts of cures, and they only take your money. We have a lot of those kind of remedies at the store, but Mr. Donker, the manager, says that they are all fakes. Don't tell me that an osteopath isn't a medicine. I know that. He's a sort of doctor, but I'll bet you he doesn't do any good. Cheer up, Job, said Christina. Faith is something. I suppose you mean well, but if I took any notice of you, I'd give up the struggle now. I don't want to depress you. You're very unkind, Christina, but I don't think you ought to be too hopeful. It would be such an awful. What's the word come down for you? Reaction, said Salt and Christina together, and they laughed. Salt went soon after, and Evie felt that a dignified protest was called for. There is no reason why you should make me look like a fool before Salt, she said, hurt. Nobody would be happier than I should be if you got well. You know that. I'm not so sure that Mr. Salt is sincere. What? Christina leaned upon her arm, and her eyes were blazing. You can say that he is old and ugly, if you like, and shabby, and anything. But don't dare to say that, Evie. Don't dare to say that he isn't sincere. Evie lay awake for a long time that night. Christina was certainly a strange girl, and when she said she did not love Salt, she was not speaking the truth. That was just how she had felt when Christina had hinted that Ronnie was not sincere. Only she had been too much of a lady to lose her temper. About old Salt, too. What did he do for a living? She must ask Christina. Chapter 12. Mr. Jan Stepp sat astride of a chair, his elbows on the backrest, his saturnine face clouded with doubt. It certainly looks like a very ordinary safe to me, Salt. Do you mean to say that an expert could not get inside without disturbing the apparatus? Huh. Impossible, replied Salt. I have filled the top chamber with water, and I have tried at least 1,000 combinations, and every time I put the combination wrong, the safe has been flooded. He twisted the dials on the face of the unpretentious repository until he brought 5 letters, one under the other, in line with an arrow engraved on the safe door. He was a long time doing this, and Stepp and the Greek watched HM. Now, said Salt. He turned the handle, and the door swung open. The contents were 2 or 3 old newspapers, and they were intact. What is the code word? Step peered forward. Oh, why did you choose that word, Salt? It is one of the very few words I can spell. Besides which, each letter is different. It is not an inappropriate word, said Meropulos, amused, and one easy to remember. I intend pasting a notice on the safe. Step, explaining frankly that unless the code word is used, and if any other combination of letters is tried, indeed, if the handle is turned, whilst the dial is set at any other word than the code word, the contents of the safe are destroyed. This may act as a deterrent to promiscuous burglars. Step fingered his stubbly beard. That will be telling people that we have something in the safe that we want to keep hidden. Huh, he said dubiously. A fool idea. Everybody has something in his safe that he wants to keep hidden, said the other coolly. Now let me try. Shut the door, Salt, that is right. Step got out of the chair to spin the dials. Now we will suppose that I am some unauthorized person trying to find a way of opening the safe. So, he turned the handle. Open it. Salt worked at the dials, and presently the door swung open. The newspapers were saturated, and an inch of water at the bottom of the safe splashed out and into a bathtub that Salt had put ready. How about cutting into the safe? Suppose I am a burglar. I burn out the lock or the side, and don't touch the combination. I have left a hole in one side of the safe, said Salt, and pointed to a rubber plug that had been rammed into a small aperture. With a pair of pincers he pulled this out, and a stream of water spurted forth, and was mostly caught in the can he held. That has the same effect, he explained. The water is pumped at a pressure into the hollow walls of the safe. The door is also hollow. When the water runs out, a float drops and releases the contents of the upper chamber. In the case of the door, the float operates the same spring that floods the safe when the handle is turned. Step scratched his head. Perfect, he said. You have experimented with the acid? Salt nodded. Both with sulfuric and hydrochloric, he said. I think hydrochloric is the better. Step turned to the Greek. You had better keep it here, he said, and then, will it be ready today? I want to get those Brackpan letters out of the way. I needn't tell you, Salt, that the code word must be known only to us 3. Huh? I don't mind your knowing. But, you Meropulos, you have got to cut out absinthe. Do you hear? Cut it out, right out. His growl became a roar that shook the room, and Meropulos quailed. It is cut out, he said sulkily. I am confining my boozing to the Parthenon. I've got to have some amusement. You have it, if all I hear is true, said Step grimly. Give Salt 100, Meropulos. It is worth it. What do you do with your money, Salt? You don't spend it on fine clothes, huh? He goes about doing good, said Meropulos, with a good-natured sneer. I met him in Kensington Gardens the other day, wheeling an interesting invalid. Who is she, Salt? My landlady's daughter, replied the other shortly. No business of yours, anyhow, growled Step. You met Miss Merville, huh? Nice lady? Yes, a very nice lady, said Salt steadily. He pushed back his long gray hair from his forehead. Pretty, huh? Salt nodded and was glad when his employer had departed. Step has gone on that girl, said Meropulos. He'd have brained you if you had said she wasn't pretty. He wouldn't have brained me, said Salt quietly. I suppose he wouldn't. Even Step would have thought twice about lifting his hand to you. He's a brute, though. I saw him smash a man in the face once for calling him a liar at a director's meeting. It was an hour before the poor devil knew what had happened. Yes, she is pretty. I see her riding some mornings, a young Diana. Delicious. I'd give a lot to be in Step's shoes. Why? Meropulos rolled a cigarette with extraordinary rapidity and lit it. Why? Well, if he wants her, he'll have her. Step is that kind. I don't suppose the doctor would have much to say in the matter. Or she, either. Salt picked up an iron bar from the table. It was one of 4 that he had brought for the purpose of strengthening the safe, and it was nearly an inch in diameter. I think she would have something to say, he said, weighing the bar on the palms of his hands. And then, to the Greek's amazement, he bent the steel into AV. He used no apparent effort. The bar just changed its shape in his hands as though it had been made of lead. Why did you do that? He gasped. I don't know, said Ambrose Salt, and with a jerk brought the steel almost straight. Phew! Meropulos took the bar from his hand. I shouldn't like to annoy you seriously, he said. He did not speak of Beryl again. Chapter 13. Evie Colebrook had found a note awaiting her at the store on the morning of the day she came home early. It consisted of a few words scrawled on a plain card, and had neither address nor signature. Dearest girl, I shall not be able to see you tonight. I have a long article to write, and shall probably be working through the night, when your dear and precious eyes are closed in sleep. Your lover. She had the card on her pillow when she slept. Are you sure you aren't too busy? Said Beryl when she came down, a radiant figure, to the waiting Ronnie. Now that you have taken up a literary career, I picture you as being rushed every hour of the day. Sarcasm is wasted on me. Ronnie displayed his beautiful teeth. Unflattering though it be, I admit to a slump in my literary stock. I have had no commissions for a week, and I'm not taking you away from any of those beautiful friends of yours. Beryl, he murmured reproachfully. You know that I have no friends, if by friends you mean girlfriends. It is my mad jealousy which makes me ask these questions, she said quizzically. Come along, Ronnie, we will be late. What the play was about, Beryl never quite remembered. Ronnie, sitting in the shade of the curtains, was more interested in his companion. It was strange that he had known her ever since she was a child and he a schoolboy, and yet had never received a true impression of her beauty. He watched her through the first act, the tilt of her chin, the quick smile. Beryl, you ought to be painted, he said in the first interval. I mean by a portrait painter. You look so perfectly splendid that I couldn't take my eyes off you. The color came slowly, and, in the dim light of the box, a man who had not been looking for this evidence of her pleasure would have seen nothing. That is a little less subtle than the usual brand of flattery you practice, isn't it, Ronnie? Or is your artlessness really an art that conceals art? I'm not flattering you. I simply speak as I feel. I never realized your loveliness until tonight. She straightened up and laughed. You think I'm crude? I suppose I am. You do not say that I am keeping my hand in, though you probably think so. I admit I have had all sorts of flirtations. In fact, I've been rather a blackguard in that way, and of course I've said nice things to girls, buttered them and played to their vanity. But if I were trying to make love to you, I should be a little more subtle, as you say. I should imply my compliments. It is just because my spasm is unpremeditated that I find myself at a loss for words. There is no sense in my making love to you, anyway, supposing that you would allow me. I can't marry. I simply won't marry until I have enough money, and I haven't nearly enough. If in 4 years' time the money doesn't come, well then, I'll risk being a pauper, but the girl will have to know. She said nothing. Here was an unexpected side to his character. He had some plan of life and a code of sorts. If she had been better acquainted with that life of his, which she so far suspected, she would have grown alert when Ronnie unmasked his way of retreat. She was surprised at his virtuous reluctance to make a woman share his comparative poverty. She should have been suspicious when he fixed a time limit to his bachelorhood. It was not like Ronnie to plan so far in advance that she knew. It might have occurred to her that he was definitely excusing the postponement of marriage. As it was, she was seeing him in a more favorable light. Ronnie desired that she should. His instinct in these matters was uncannily accurate. It was worth coming out with you, if only to hear your views on matrimony, was all the comment she made. I don't know. He looked gloomily into the auditorium. In many ways, I have been regretting it. That doesn't sound gallant, but I'm not in a mood for nice speeches. You think I am? I did not mean to be nice when I said that you were lovely, any more than I wish to be nice to Titian when I praise his pictures. Beryl, I've been fond of you for years. I suppose I've been in love with you, though I've never wanted to be. That is the truth. I've recognized just how unfair it would be to chain a woman like you to a rake. I'm not sparing myself, like me. God knows whether I could be constant. In my heart, I know that if I had you, there could be no other woman in the world for me. An intimate knowledge of my own character makes me skeptical. Beryl was spared the necessity for replying. The curtain went up on the second act just then. She knew he was looking at her, and turned in her chair to hide her face. Her heart was beating tumultuously. She was trembling. She was a fool. He meant nothing. He was a liar, lied as readily as other men spoke the truth. That frankness of his was assumed. He was acting, versed in the weaknesses of women. He had chosen the only approach that would storm her citadel. She told herself these truths. her reason battling in a last desperate stand against his attack. And yet, why should he not be sincere? For the first time, he had admitted the unpleasant charges which hitherto he had denied. He surely could not expect to make her love him more by the confession of his infidelities. If he had followed up his talk, had made any attempt to carry on the conversation from the point where he left it, she would have been invincible. But he did not. When the curtain went down again, he was more cheerful and was seemingly interested only in the people he recognized in the stalls. He asked her if she would mind if he left her. He wanted to smoke and to meet some men he knew. She assented and was disappointed. They had a long wait between these two acts, and as he had returned to the box after a shorter interval than she had expected, there was plenty of time, had he so wished, to have resumed his conversation. He showed no such desire, and it was she who began it. "You puzzle me, Ronnie. I can't see, if you loved me, how you could do some of the things you have done. You won't be so commonplace as to tell me that you wanted to keep me out of your mind and that form of amusement helped you to forget me." "No," he admitted, "but, Beryl dear, need we discuss it? I don't know why I spoke to you as I did. I felt like it, but I am going to discuss it," she insisted. "I want my mind set in order. It is overthrown for the moment. What prevented you from keeping me as a friend all this time? A real close friend, if you loved me. Oh, Ronnie, I do want to be fair to you even at the risk of being shameless, as I am now. Why could you not have asked me, even if it meant waiting?" He looked down at the floor. "I have some sense of decency left," he said in a low voice. And then the curtain went up. Beryl looked at her program. The play had 4 acts. There was another interval. He did not leave her this time, nor did he wait for her to begin. "I'm going to be straight with you, Beryl," he said. "I want you. I adore you. But I cannot commit you to an engagement which may adversely affect your father and incidentally myself. I am being brutally selfish and mercenary, but I am going to say what I think. You'll be amused and perhaps horrified when I tell you that Stepp is very keen on you." She was neither amused nor horrified. But on the other hand, if Ronnie Morel realized that in his invention he had accidentally hit upon the truth, he would not have been amused, and most certainly terror would have struck him dumb. If Beryl had only said what she was of a mind to say, that she had learned from her father that Stepp was in love with her, she might have silenced him. But she said nothing. Ronnie's explanation seemed natural. Knowing Ronnie, "I'd sooner see you dead than married to him," he said vehemently. "But none of us can say that now. We are in a very tight place. Stepp could ruin your father with a gesture. He could very seriously inconvenience me." Here he was much in earnest, and the girl, with a cold feeling at her heart, knew he spoke the truth. "But that time will pass. We shall weather the storm which is shrieking round our ears. You don't read the financial papers. You're wise. You see what might happen, Beryl?" Beryl nodded. She was ridiculously happy. "A great play. Don't you think so, Miss Merville?" It was Sir John Maxton who had pushed through the crowd in the vestibule. "Splendid," she said. "Ronnie, did you like it?" "I never heard a word," said Ronnie. And somehow that statement was so consonant with his new honesty that it confirmed her in a faith which was as novel. The car carried them through the crowded circus and into the quietude of Piccadilly. "Oh, Ronnie, I am so happy." His arm slipped round her, and his lips pressed fiercely against her red mouth. "Why can't you sleep?" asked the drowsy Christina, as the girl lit her candle for the second time. "I don't know. I'm having such beastly dreams," said Evie fretfully.